My name is Sarah, a digital artist by profession and a homebody by choice. I take great pride in my work and an equal amount of pride in the small yet cozy house I own. That's why it was so significant for me to take the big step into marriage. The one I chose for this life-altering journey was Mark, a corporate guy with a swagger that could fill a room. He was seemingly perfect, charming, smart, and from a reputable family. I thought I had hit the jackpot. But as the saying goes, all that glitters is not gold, and my wedding was the first place I saw the tarnish on what I thought was a golden life ahead. From the get-go, planning the wedding felt like a struggle for control between me and my soon-to-be mother-in-law, Alice. She was a traditionally minded woman with a propensity for passive-aggressive remarks. She insisted on a lavish, old-fashioned wedding, drowning me in a sea of flower arrangements, table settings, and uncomfortable family traditions. On the day of the wedding, my anxiety was through the roof. I had managed to maintain a cheerful facade, but deep down, I knew something was off. Mark seemed distant, almost like he was a spectator at his own wedding. But what really broke me was Alice's behavior. As I stepped out of the car in my carefully chosen wedding dress, I could feel Alice's eyes on me, scanning me from head to toe. She sauntered over, and in a tone icy enough to give anyone chills, said, "Oh, Sarah, what an ugly shade of white your dress is. It hardly does anything for your complexion." I felt my face flush. It took every ounce of restraint I had to keep a smile plastered on my face. I glanced over at Mark, expecting him to intervene, but he remained silent, staring off into the distance. "Mom, let's just get through the day," he finally said in a tone so dismissive it felt like a slap in the face. Inside, the tension only escalated. Alice seemed determined to find fault with everything, from the music to the food. At one point, she took it upon herself to lecture my little sister on her table manners, a 12-year-old who was already nervous about the big day. "Alice, she's just a child," I intervened, trying to keep my voice steady. "Discipline starts young," she retorted, eyeing me as if I were the one in need of discipline. During the toast, Alice barely masked her disdain. She stood up, glass in hand, and said, "To Sarah and Mark, may you have a life filled with as much joy as this wonderful day." Her eyes met mine, and I knew wonderful was the furthest thing from her mind. Again, I looked to Mark for support. He raised his glass, but said nothing, his eyes avoiding mine, as if the love we professed was a lie we both chose to live. That's when it hit me. I was on my own in this marriage, wedged between a man who refused to stand up for me and a mother-in-law hell-bent on making my life miserable. The day that was supposed to mark the beginning of our happily ever after felt more like the prologue to a grim tale. As we drove off to our honeymoon, me clinging to my bouquet like a shield against the battles to come, I realized that this wedding was an omen, a prelude to the struggle that lay ahead. Mark was physically beside me, but in every way that mattered, I was horribly, dreadfully alone. That's how our marriage started, with the sinister undertones of a wedding that wasn't really a wedding but a theater of pretense. Little did I know that this was just the beginning and worse was yet to come. After the wedding and a strangely muted honeymoon, Mark and I moved into my house. I was thrilled at first. I'd always envisioned married life as an unbroken series of tender moments and shared laughter, a never-ending honeymoon of sorts. How naive I was. I had not accounted for Alice, who seemed to see my house as enemy territory she needed to conquer. Just weeks into our marriage, Alice began visiting regularly, arriving unannounced and pushing open the door as if she owned the place. Each visit was like a whirlwind of criticism and passive-aggressive comments that turned my peaceful abode into a combat zone. On one such occasion, I had just prepared dinner, carefully following a recipe I'd found online. I was excited to share it with Mark, but when Alice just breezed in, she took one look at the meal and scrunched up her nose in disapproval. "Sarah, when will you learn to cook like a real wife?" she said, poking at the lasagna as if it were a science experiment gone wrong. I clenched my jaw, forcing a smile. "Well, it's a new recipe. I thought Mark might like a change," I said. Alice smirked, Mark has been eating my cooking for years. He won't know what good food is if you keep serving him this slop. At that moment, I expected Mark to stand up for me, to tell his mother that he appreciated my efforts. Instead, he swallowed a bite of lasagna and almost mechanically nodded along with Alice. Mom's got a point, Sarah. The lasagna is a bit dry, he said. I felt my stomach sink. Mark's betrayal was 1,000 times more piercing than Alice's critique. One evening, Alice took it a step further. I had redecorated the living room, putting up new curtains and arranging the furniture in a way that maximized space and comfort. I was rather pleased with the result, but Alice, she had other thoughts. Who chose these curtains? They clash horribly with the furniture, she declared, eyeing the fabric as if it were contaminated. I chose them, actually. I thought they added a bit of color, I responded, my voice shaking more than I would have liked. Color? Is that what you call it? I call it a mess, Alice retorted, chuckling as if she'd said something profoundly witty. Mark, who had been flicking through a magazine, looked up briefly and said, Mom might be onto something, Sarah. Maybe you could use her help in choosing the next set. Of course she could, Alice chimed in, wearing a self-satisfied grin. After all, I have years of experience making a house a home. Her words, delivered in that grating tone of hers, felt like a slap in the face. This was my home, a place I had built long before Mark or Alice stepped into it. Yet it was being colonized one criticism at a time, and the person who was supposed to be my partner in this life journey was aiding and abetting the invasion. It was then that I realized if the man who vowed to stand by me was not just permitting this emotional sabotage, but even then, in that moment of agonizing clarity, I couldn't fathom the depth of my isolation, the extent to which these two people would go to shatter the sanctuary I had built. And so, amidst the battleground that my home was becoming, I kept waiting for things to improve, for Mark to finally take my side, for Alice to get tired of her own bitterness. In hindsight, I should have known better, for the next blow was about to land. A blow that would irrevocably shatter the shaky ground on which my marriage stood. The notion that things couldn't possibly get worse was a naivety I could no longer afford. And just when I thought I had acclimated to my new normal, the unthinkable happened. One evening, Alice showed up at our doorstep, not just with her usual bag of condescension, but with suitcases, boxes, and what seemed like half her house in tow. I've decided to move in, she announced, pushing her way past me into the living room. Excuse me, move in with us. I stammered, my eyes darting toward Mark, who seemed astonishingly unperturbed by this development. Well, yes, I'm getting older, and I'd like to spend more time with my son, Alice said, beginning to unpack her things as if the decision was already final. I looked at Mark, my eyes practically screaming for him to do something. Mark, can I talk to you for a moment? I pulled him aside, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mark, this can't happen. She can't just move in. Our marriage is already strained, and her being here will make it impossible to mend anything, I whispered urgently. Mark sighed. Look, she's my mom, Sarah. She needs to be closer to her family now. We have to adjust. Adjust? I've been adjusting since day one, Mark. When will you adjust for me? When will you stand up for us? For our home, our marriage? The words poured out of me like a dam breaking. Mark looked away, avoiding my gaze. She's already here, Sarah. It would be rude to ask her to leave now. So there it was. Alice moved in, and with her came a nightmare I had not dared to imagine. Every day was a new battle. She criticized the way I arranged the furniture, how I did the laundry, even how I breathed. And each time Mark stood silently by, his apathy condoning her abusive behavior. But it wasn't just the daily nitpicking and criticisms that wore me down. It was the evident joy she took in making me miserable. One day, while cleaning the house, I discovered a bag of prescription medications hidden away in the kitchen cupboard. Pills for anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, the works. When I confronted her about it, she exploded. Who do you think you are snooping around my things? You are nothing, a guest in my son's life, and you have no business in my private affairs, she shrieked. A guest in my own house? The audacity was astonishing. But what was even more astonishing was that Mark, who had overheard the entire conversation, chose that moment to speak up, not in my defense, but in hers. Sarah, if my mom says they're private, then they're private. Stay out of it, he admonished, once again picking the wrong side of a very clear moral divide. It was a betrayal too great to comprehend fully, and I found myself numb, unable to react. That's when it dawned on me. Alice wasn't just a hostile mother-in-law. She was a predator, systematically breaking down my defenses and claiming my life as her territory. And Mark, he wasn't aloof or indifferent. He was complicit, actively or passively aiding her in the destruction of our marriage. In that moment, as I looked at Alice's triumphant smirk and Mark's avoiding eyes, I made a decision. I wouldn't just be a spectator in this tragedy. I would take control of my life, even if it meant breaking away from the people who were supposed to be my family. But as it turned out, fate had another curveball to throw my way, one that would finally compel me to act, to bring an end to this farce that my life had become. In the weeks following Alice's uninvited occupation of my home, my life devolved into a living nightmare. The constant surveillance, the petty criticisms, and the ever-looming shadow of my mother-in-law made each day an exercise in emotional survival. Her reign of terror expanded from mere commentary on my cooking and decorating to include personal jabs about my looks, my intelligence, and even my worthiness as a spouse. One evening, as we all sat in the living room, Alice began picking at another one of my failures. This time, it was my career, or according to her, my lack of one. You know, a good wife would contribute more than just bad cooking to her family. A job wouldn't hurt, you know. Not that you'd be qualified for anything worthwhile, she sneered. Though her words were like daggers, I couldn't let her see me bleed. I have a job, Alice, I retorted, and my income is just as crucial to this household as Mark's is. Is that so? She raised an eyebrow. Then why are we living in your shabby little house rather than a home that reflects the dignity of my son? Before I could muster a response, Mark, who had been engrossed in his phone, chimed in. Mom's got a point, Sarah. You could be doing more. We could be doing better. It felt like a sucker punch. Each syllable was a betrayal, each word a new crack in the already fragile foundation of our marriage. As I struggled to hold back tears, Mark got up, patting his mother on the back as he left the room, leaving me alone with the she-wolf who had infiltrated my life. With Mark gone, Alice leaned closer and whispered, "You see, he'll always be my son. You're just the girl he settled for." I turned away, my body trembling with a cocktail of fury and humiliation. My eyes fell on our wedding photo, a staged moment of Fox happiness. How had I ended up here? When had my love story turned into a grotesque theater of cruelty? The nightmare escalated when one day I found something alarming while cleaning the kitchen, a small packet of unidentified pills stashed behind the spice jars. My mind raced through the possibilities. When I confronted Alice about it, her reaction was nothing short of explosive. "How dare you invade my privacy, you insolent child? It's none of your business," she roared, her face red with fury. For the first time, I didn't hold back. "This is my house, Alice, and what you're doing is illegal. This affects me too." Just then, Mark entered the room, visibly annoyed. "What's going on here? Ask your wife. She's turned into a detective, snooping through other people's stuff." Alice spat, throwing me a venomous look. Mark turned to me, his voice icy. "Sarah, why can't you just let things be? Why are you causing problems?" That's when it hit me. There was no team in this marriage. Mark wasn't just failing to protect me. He was actively siding with the enemy. I felt like a stranger in my own home, suffocating under the weight of their combined disdain. But little did they know, their actions were only steeling my resolve. I would not be cowed. I would not let them break me. I would survive this nightmare and emerge stronger. And as events soon unfolded, I would get an unexpected opportunity to turn the tables, to finally reclaim my life and self-respect from the clutches of this unholy alliance. Mark's friend Jake was throwing a party, and despite my reservations about appearing in public as the happy couple, I was practically forced to attend. Maybe part of me also wanted a brief respite, a night off from the persistent nightmare that my home had become. "Come on, Sarah, it'll be good for us. We need a break," Mark insisted, his words more an instruction than a request. We arrived at Jake's lavish house, and for the first half-hour or so, everything seemed normal. People laughed, glasses clinked, and music filled the air. But as the night wore on, I realized Mark was increasingly distant. He mingled, but more with others than with me, and when I did catch his eye, he seemed almost irritated by my presence. Then Mark vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. After searching unsuccessfully among the guests, I started to check the less populated areas of the house. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle followed by a voice unmistakably Mark's. My heart sank even before I reached the door from which the sounds emanated. Taking a deep breath to brace myself for whatever lay beyond, I'd opened the door. There he was, Mark, entangled with another woman, neither of them noticing my entrance. For what felt like an eternity. When they finally did, the look on his face wasn't one of guilt or regret. It was annoyance. "Sarah, what the hell? Haven't you heard of knocking?" Mark snapped, as if I was the one in the wrong. "Knocking? Are you serious? What are you doing, Mark?" My voice trembled, not with sadness, but with fiery rage. "Just catching up with an old friend," he replied, a smirk replacing his initial annoyance. The room spun around me. Catching up? Is that what we're calling it now? I couldn't contain my contempt. His face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and fury. "You're making a scene. Let's talk about this at home," he said. But I was done talking. I was done with the humiliation, the abuse, and the blatant disrespect. I stormed out, my entire body shaking. Mark didn't follow me. He didn't even call out as I left. I went home alone, my mind racing but surprisingly clear. A line had been crossed, a boundary irrevocably broken. The next morning, Mark sauntered into the house as if nothing had happened. It was then that Alice, ever the opportunist, decided to intervene. "I heard about last night," she began, her voice dripping with Fox concern. "You should know better than to embarrass yourself and my son like that." That was the last straw. "Embarrass me? You have the audacity to talk to me about embarrassment after everything you and your son have done." My voice rose, each word fueled by months of pent-up anger and frustration. Alice reached for her phone. "If you don't calm down, I'll call the police." "Go ahead," I said, locking eyes with her as I dialed my own number into the phone. "They might be interested in the package in the kitchen cupboard." Mark looked puzzled, then alarmed. But before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. As I opened the door to the police officers, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It was as if all the chaos, all the pain, had crystallized into this singular moment of clarity. It was time for my nightmare to end and for theirs to begin. The police officers were puzzled but professional. "We received a call about a domestic disturbance," one of them inquired. "Yes, and while you're here, I think you should check our kitchen cupboard. I found something that you might find interesting," I responded, meeting Alice's eyes as I spoke. Her face went ashen, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of fear replace her habitual sneer. "What is she talking about, Mom?" Mark looked from me to his mother, his confusion giving way to panic. "Mind showing us what you're referring to, ma'am?" The officer's gaze was stern but curious as I led them to the kitchen and pointed to the cupboard. Mark's voice wavered in a desperate tone. "Mom, what did you do?" The officers found the packet of pills and immediately turned to Alice. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us." "But those aren't mine," Alice stammered, her voice quivering with disbelief. "That can be sorted out later. For now, you are under arrest," the officer replied, cuffing her as she shot me a look of raw, impotent rage. After the police had taken Alice away, I turned to Mark, who seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Is this what you wanted, Sarah? To destroy this family? Destroy this family? I echoed incredulously. Mark, you and your mother destroyed this family long before today. You cheated on me, belittled me, allowed your mother to abuse me in my own home. The destruction was your doing, not mine. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. So what now? Divorce? Is that what you want? For the first time, Mark, it's not about what you or your mother want. It's about what I deserve. And yes, I deserve better than this farce of a marriage. Within weeks, the divorce proceedings were underway. I couldn't say it was a pleasant experience, but it was necessary. The trial that followed was the reckoning for both Mark and Alice. My soon-to-be ex-husband was exposed for the spineless enabler he was, while his mother received a 5-year prison sentence for possession of illegal substances. As I sat in the courtroom, watching Alice being led away, a wave of mixed emotions washed over me. Victory, certainly, but also a profound sadness for what could have, should have been a loving family. Mark caught my eye and looked away, unable to hold my gaze. The man I had married was a stranger, one I was finally free from. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor like the ticking of a clock. Each step took me further away from the nightmare my life had become. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized that this was not just an ending but also a new beginning. The years that followed were about rediscovery and healing, and though the scars remained, they served as a constant reminder of my own strength, resilience, and self-worth. The nightmare was over, but the lessons it taught me would last a lifetime. I had faced the worst and survived, emerging not as a victim, but as a woman who would never again settle for anything less than what she deserved. My name is Abigail, and for a fleeting moment, I believed that the wedding aisle would be a pathway to a new happy life. A simple woman with an 8-year-old son, Tim, from my previous marriage, I had dreams like anyone else: love, companionship, and a stable family. Tim was skeptical about changes, but he'd warmed up to Henry, my new husband, quickly enough. We were small, imperfect, but content. That is, until Clara happened. The wedding was a grand affair. Clara, as the mother of the groom, had somehow assumed the role of a wedding planner with dictatorial powers. The venue, the flowers, and even my gown, she had something to say about everything. The more she micromanaged, the more I felt like an outsider at my own wedding. Abby, don't you think you should reconsider that dress? She scoffed as I tried on my bridal gown. Actually, I really love this dress, I defended, hoping Henry would step in. That's just how she is, Abby, Henry mumbled, not meeting my eyes. She means well. The night before the wedding, as we were setting up, Clara berated the florist for the choice of roses. Don't you have something more exotic? These are just so common, much like Abby's taste, she criticized. This time, I couldn't contain myself. Clara looked at me as if I were an irritating fly she couldn't swat away. My son deserves the best, and if you can't provide it, then someone has to, she declared. Henry was right there, but he said nothing, just sighed, giving me a look as if to say, "What can we do?" The final straw came during the wedding reception. Tim, nervous but excited, had prepared a small speech. As he stood up to speak, Clara loudly whispered, "Oh God, what is the child going to babble about?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. I looked at Henry, waiting for him to defend our new family, but he did nothing as Tim nervously read his heartfelt speech. It was then that I realized I had made a monumental mistake. I was now tied to a man who would never stand up for me, and worse, to a woman who would forever undermine me. That night, as I slipped into my wedding bed, Henry sensed my unhappiness, but dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "You know how mothers are, Abby. Give it time," he said. "Time for what? For her to completely belittle me? For you to finally stand up for your wife?" I replied, but Henry sighed. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. Sleep, okay. Tomorrow is a new day." Yes, a new day, the first in a series of miserable days that were to come. But back then, I didn't know that. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, pondering the gravity of the vows we just made, vows that already felt broken. After the chaos of the wedding, I foolishly thought that life would settle into some semblance of normalcy. Henry moved into the home that Tim and I had made for ourselves over the years. This had been a joyous period, a honeymoon phase filled with new beginnings. But Clara's influence was as invasive as ivy creeping through the cracks and choking the life out of our new family. The first visit happened just a week after our wedding. It was a Sunday, and I was busy making a family dinner, something to celebrate our first week as a married couple. The menu was classic comfort food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. I was just setting the table when Clara breezed into our home like an unexpected cold front. "Oh my, what an interesting spread," she declared, as if she were a judge on some kind of culinary TV show. Her eyes roved dismissively over the dishes on the table. "I thought it would be nice to have a home-cooked meal for our first Sunday dinner together," I explained, trying to hide my annoyance. "That might be what you're accustomed to, but Henry was raised with more sophisticated tastes," Clara countered, twisting her lips into a sly smile. Henry, who had been conspicuously silent, suddenly found his voice. "Mom, Abby worked hard on this. Let's just enjoy the meal," he said. But his words lacked force or conviction. Was this an ally or another passive observer in my life? I couldn't help but wonder. We sat down for dinner, but Clara's eyes didn't miss a thing. She commented on how the living room could use a woman's touch, hinting at its inadequacy. She criticized the way Tim held his fork, offering to enroll him in etiquette classes. And when I finally brought out my homemade apple pie, a family recipe passed down from my grandmother, she took one bite and said, "Oh dear, did you mistake salt for sugar?" The air was so thick with tension, you could slice it with a knife. Tim appeared increasingly uneasy, shrinking in his seat like a violet. Henry silently consumed his meal, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "Clara, you've made your points. Is there anything you actually like about this place? Or are you just here to make us feel unwelcome in our own home?" I finally burst out, unable to contain myself any longer. Clara looked at me with feigned surprise, as if she had been offering constructive criticism all along. "I'm just trying to help you be a better fit for my son." Henry's voice finally interjected, albeit weakly. "Mom, let's keep the criticism down, okay?" he continued. "But I'm just saying," Clara began, only to be interrupted by Henry. "No, Mom, enough," he asserted, but the lack of force in his words made them almost meaningless. Clara pursed her lips and went quiet, but the damage was done. We finished our meal in silence, each bite tasting like sawdust. When Clara finally left the house, it felt like a battleground after a war, scarred and void of life. That night, as I cleaned up the kitchen, I wondered how many more of these family dinners I could endure. Tim, who had retreated to his room right after dessert, was the silent victim in all of this. And Henry, he was becoming more of a mystery each day, a man torn between two worlds, neither of which he was willing to fully inhabit. Henry came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "She'll get better, Abby. You'll see," he reassured me. I wanted to believe him, but as I looked around my own home, a place that had once been my son's sanctuary, but now felt like hostile territory, I couldn't help but wonder. Would we ever truly be a family, or were we doomed to live in the shadow of a woman hell-bent on keeping us apart? By the time winter rolled in, the tension in our home had reached its boiling point. Every visit from Clara turned into a grueling ordeal, each insult cutting deeper than the last. Tim had become increasingly withdrawn, and even Henry seemed to sense that things were unraveling. However, instead of confronting his mother, Henry suggested that I make more effort to get along with her. "I don't know how much more I can take, Henry," I said to him one evening as we lay in bed. "Your mother treats this house like it's her kingdom, and we are merely her subjects." Henry rolled onto his side to face me. "She's a strong personality, sure, but she's also my mother, Abby. Can't you try to see the good in her?" Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Henry about a car ride the next evening. Just the girls, Tim, and me to clear the air. I looked at Henry puzzled. Your mother wants to go for a car ride to clear the air. What do you think she's up to? I asked. I don't know, Abby, but maybe it's a good sign. Maybe she's trying to make amends, he suggested, ever the optimist where his mother was concerned. My gut told me to decline the invitation, but against my better judgment, I agreed. What was the worst that could happen? I thought. Little did I know, I was walking straight into a trap. The next evening, we bundled up and climbed into Clara's luxury SUV. Tim sat in the back, his face lit by the glow of his handheld gaming device, clearly wanting to be anywhere else but there. I rode shotgun nervously, fiddling with my seat belt as Clara drove. So, where are we going? I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. Just a little drive around town. It's good to talk in a neutral setting, Clara replied, her eyes focused on the road. Neutral since when is your car neutral? I thought to myself. But I said nothing, hoping for the best. A half hour into the drive, Clara finally broke the silence. Abigail, I've been doing some thinking, and it's become painfully obvious that you're out of your depth here, she declared. Excuse me? I replied, stunned by the directness of her insult. You heard me. You're a divorcee with a child, trying to fit into a life you know nothing about. Henry deserves a woman who can actually add something valuable to his life, she continued, her words landing like a heavy blow. The audacity of her words left me breathless. I looked at Tim through the rearview mirror. He had removed his headphones and was listening intently, concern filling his young eyes. Clara, you've got it all wrong. I love Henry, and he loves me, and Tim is a part of that package, I asserted, my voice trembling with emotion. Love? What'd you call love? I call settling, she retorted, pulling the car to the side of the road near a stretch of deserted land. I think it's time for you and Tim to get out and think about what you've done to my family. You can't be serious. It's freezing out there, I protested. Very serious. Now get out, she commanded, her voice steely. I glanced at Tim, his face a mixture of confusion and fear, and I knew I had to protect him. As we stepped out into the cold, Clara sped off, leaving us stranded miles from home. We started walking, our steps heavy, each footfall a painful reminder of the trap we had just walked into. But with each step, I also felt a new resolve forming inside me. Clara had overplayed her hand this time, and I was ready to finally end this game. The moment the car's taillights disappeared into the distance, the gravity of our situation sank in. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, under a moonless sky with temperatures plummeting. I looked down at Tim. His eyes were wide, a mix of fear and disbelief clouding his young face. Mom, why did Grandma do that? Tim's voice wavered as he spoke, his breath visible in the icy air. I don't know, baby, but we're going to be okay. I promise, I said, mustering as much strength as I could. I took out my phone. No signal, of course. Clara had chosen a place far removed from civilization for her cruel scheme. Which way is home? Tim asked, shivering. We're too far from our house. But my parents live about 8 kilometers that way, I said, pointing down the road that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walk was excruciating. With each step, the cold seemed to pierce deeper into our bones. We were not dressed for this kind of weather, not prepared for this brutal test of endurance. A couple of times, Tim stumbled, and each time he did, my heart sank. I couldn't help but think of the irreparable damage Clara was causing, not just between her and me, but between her and her own grandson. Halfway through, Tim's complaints about his cold hands grew more urgent. My fingers hurt, Mom, he said, his voice trembling. I tried rubbing them, blowing on them, doing anything I could to bring some warmth back into his tiny red hands, but I knew we were in a bad situation that was getting worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the distant lights of my parents' home flickered on the horizon like a beacon in the dark. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but as we reached the doorstep, and I looked down at Tim's hands, my heart sank. His fingers were an alarming shade of white. Mom, Dad, we need help, I screamed as I banged on their front door. Within seconds, they were there, rushing us inside. My mother gasped when she saw Tim's hands, and my father immediately started the car to take us to the hospital. Before we left, I grabbed my phone, finally back in signal range, and dialed Clara's number. "You've gone too far this time," I hissed into the phone when she picked up. "Tim has frostbite because of you. I'm taking this to the authorities." There was a momentary pause on the other end. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I would, and I will." "This ends now," I replied, hanging up. As we drove to the hospital, my father at the wheel, my mother comforting Tim in the back seat, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that we had escaped a potentially deadly situation, anger at Clara for what she had done, but most of all, a newfound determination. Clara had unleashed something in me that she hadn't anticipated. She wanted to break me, but instead, she had fortified my resolve to put an end to her reign of terror once and for all. The sterile smell of the hospital was as unnerving as always, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of urgency and dread. Tim was rushed into the emergency room, where the medical staff immediately started treating his frostbitten hands. My parents sat with me in the waiting area, their faces etched with concern and anger. "Abigail, are you gonna let this go?" "You can't let Clara get away with this," my father urged, his voice tinged with disbelief. "No, Dad, I won't let her get away with it. I've already called a lawyer. We're going to sue her," I said, my voice filled with newfound determination. I looked at my mom. Her eyes were filled with worry. "Pride, good for you, honey. No one has the right to treat you or Tim like this, not even family," she said. My phone buzzed. It was Henry. "Addie, my mom called me, said you're making threats." "What's going on?" "The threats, as you call them, are promises, Henry. Your mother left Tim and me in the middle of nowhere in freezing temperatures. Tim has frostbite. We're in the hospital," I replied, my voice quivering with a mix of fear and anger. There was silence on the other end. "I can't believe she would do something like that. I'm coming to the hospital." "Don't bother," I snapped, cutting the call. Minutes turned to hours, but finally a doctor emerged from the ER. "Your son is stable now. We've managed to treat the frostbite, but he'll need ongoing care and physical therapy. There might be long-term damage." I felt a range of emotions, relief that Tim was okay, but also a smoldering rage towards Clara for causing this agony in the first place. This was the turning point. There was no going back. When we returned home, my lawyer called. "We've got a strong case, Abigail. We can not only sue for emotional distress, but also for child endangerment. Let's do it. Let's make sure she can never harm anyone again," I said, resolved. Later that night, Clara called. Her voice trembled. "Abigail, can we talk?" "No, Clara, we can't. Your time for talking is over. See you in court." After hanging up, I felt neither satisfaction nor victory. Those emotions would perhaps never come in a situation as ugly as this. But what I did feel was empowerment. For the first time, I was taking control of my life, standing up against the tyranny that Clara had imposed on us for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles and probably a divorce, but one thing was clear. I was no longer the woman who would be pushed into the corner, who would be silenced and mistreated. This was my turning point, and from here on, there would be no looking back. The courtroom was a whirlpool of tension, but as I sat there awaiting the verdict, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Across from me, Clara looked visibly distressed, her eyes darting between her lawyer and the judge. Henry was there too, but we hardly exchanged glances. We had become strangers bound only by the impending legal outcomes. "Does the prosecution have any closing statements?" the judge inquired, his eyes scanning the room. My lawyer rose from his seat. "Your Honor, the evidence and testimonies clearly demonstrate that Mrs. Clara Edwards knowingly and intentionally endangered the lives of Abigail and her son Tim. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a calculated act of cruelty that could have resulted in a far greater tragedy." The room fell silent as the judge turned to Clara's defense attorney. "Your Honor," he began, struggling to make eye contact, "Mrs. Edwards deeply regrets the emotional strain she's caused her family. but she insists her actions were not intended to bring physical harm. That's irrelevant, the judge interrupted. Intention to harm or not, harm was done. The evidence is clear. As the judge retreated to his chamber for the final verdict, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. It was a message from Henry. Are you happy now? I looked up and caught his eye. Am I happy? My son could have suffered irreparable harm. This isn't about happiness, it's about justice. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge returned. I've considered the evidence and testimonies carefully, he began, shuffling his papers. It is the court's decision that Mrs. Clara Edwards is guilty on counts of child endangerment and emotional distress. She is hereby sentenced to 2 years in a federal prison. The room seemed to both tense up and exhale at the same time, as if everyone had been holding their breath. Clara's face turned a shade paler, her eyes widening in disbelief. Henry looked lost, but at that moment I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. As people started filing out of the courtroom, Clara approached me, tears streaming down her face. "Abigail, can you ever forgive me?" she asked. "I think you should be asking Tim for forgiveness, not me," I replied coldly. "But even if he forgives you, things will never be the same. You've lost not just a daughter-in-law, but a grandson too." Walking out of the courtroom, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. This was not a happy ending. Too much pain had been inflicted for happiness to have a place here. But it was a just ending, one that held the promise of new beginnings. That evening, I sat down with Tim and explained that his grandma Clara would be going away for a while. "Why, Mom?" he asked, his eyes full of questions. I didn't have simple answers to that. Sometimes people make very bad choices, and they have to face the consequences, I said, pulling him into a hug. As I held him, I knew that the most challenging part of our journey was behind us. It was time to rebuild and move forward, not just as survivors, but as warriors who have faced down their demons and emerged stronger on the other side. And so we did. I filed for divorce, focused on Tim's recovery, and took time to heal. No, things would never go back to the way they were, but they could certainly get better. And in that promise of better, I found my revenge, my justice, and my peace. I'm 27, female, 7 months pregnant. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law recently hosted a baby shower for me. About a week ago, my mother-in-law, Donna, 55, and my sister-in-law, Erica, 30, don't like me for a couple of reasons. My husband, Thomas, 30, married me about a year ago, and I quit my job after that because I wanted to be a stay-at-home wife. It wasn't that I didn't want to work. I had just been working for a really long time. I'd been working ever since I was 16 and didn't stop until I had a ring on my finger, and only when Thomas told me that he'd be okay with me staying at home. My dad passed away when I was 12 from a cardiac arrest, and after that, it was just me and my mother. My mother was a waitress at the local diner, and money was tight, so I had to start working part-time at 16, and then full-time once I was done with high school. I didn't even get to go to college, but thankfully I worked in sales and I was decent at my job, so I was able to bring home enough income for my mother and me to get by. It was through work that I met Thomas, and we hit it off at a conference, and the rest is history. Unfortunately, while my life story of rags to riches might seem fascinating to most people, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law do not agree and think that I am a gold digger. Thomas was a branch manager at his firm and worked in a much higher position than me when I first met him. But that was not what drew me to him. I've never been able to explain to Donna and Erica that his bank balance had nothing to do with my love for him, and I would have married him even if he was a pauper. I knew that they would never accept me, so I didn't even try to impress them or win them over. And that just made me even more unpopular with them. In short, they didn't like me, and I didn't try to make them, so we just never got along. But after I announced my pregnancy, the two of them suddenly started showing an interest in my life, and I guess that was because I was carrying Thomas's future child, because otherwise, they would avoid talking to me as much as they could, and would only be civil to me out of courtesy. They started being very helpful and kind to me after the pregnancy announcement, and Thomas believed that they were finally warming up to me. But I could tell that something fishy was going on. It was just my sixth sense. I couldn't bring myself to fully trust them. But after a couple of months, when they still hadn't said or done anything cruel to me, I started to believe that maybe they were actually trying to make amends for all the digs and insults in the past, implying that I was a gold digger and I was with Thomas just for his money. So I started trusting them and thought of them as my well-wishers, which they most certainly are not. A couple of weeks ago, they asked me if I was okay with them hosting a baby shower for me. By then, they had established enough trust with me, so I greenlit it and even provided them with a list of guests I wanted to be invited to my baby shower. My mother wanted to be involved in the planning, but Donna and Erica told her that they got it and that she didn't need to worry about anything. I guess I should have known right then, and there was something weird going on, but I didn't suspect anything. I figured that they just wanted it to be a surprise for me, so they didn't want my mother to be involved. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear anything about the baby shower until they sent me an invitation. I even checked in with all the guests that I had asked for, and all of them received it as well. So I believed that they were doing everything perfectly, and I was actually happy. Then, last week, finally on the day of the baby shower, I accidentally read the time wrong and showed up an hour early at the venue. They wanted it to be an all-women event because they wanted to take the more traditional route, and I was okay with it. So my husband wasn't there, and I had to take a cab to get to the venue because I didn't feel like driving. Once I got there, I realized that I was an hour early since I couldn't see any cars in the parking lot apart from donors. So I decided to give them a surprise and made sure that I headed towards the doors very quietly so they wouldn't hear me coming. Then I peeped in to check out what they were up to. I saw them casting a video on a screen that they'd set up, and it was just the two of them having a go at me in the video, saying the most horrible things about me and then laughing. I could tell that the video was from quite a while back because in the video, Erica had blonde hair, and she only had that shade around the time of my wedding. So I guessed that this video had probably been recorded at that time. I was horrified at the things that they were saying, and I couldn't believe that they were playing this in the place where they were supposed to host my baby shower. One of the things that Erica said was that she knew for a fact that I'd probably get pregnant within the first year of my marriage so that I could really tie her brother down, and he'd never be able to escape ever, and even if he tried to, I would always have the child support and alimony to look forward to. And then the two of them laughed in the video and also in real life. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to enter the room and confront them about that video. They were pretty startled to see me and tried to stop sharing it on that screen. But they didn't know that it was already too late, and I'd seen everything that they didn't want me to see. I asked them why they were playing that video and when they had even recorded it or why. So Erica tried to explain to me that this was a roast video that they had recorded from my wedding. But they didn't actually get to play it because Thomas threatened to cut ties with them if they pulled off something like that. And honestly, good thinking on his part because I wouldn't have been able to tolerate this at my wedding. I know that roasts are meant to be funny, but it's only funny when people who you love are the ones roasting you. Not so much when you know that the people saying terrible things about you actually mean those things. And I knew for a fact that Erica and Donna meant every single word of what they were saying in that video. They tried to tell me that they had included the pregnancy joke so they could play it at the baby shower and pass it off as a joke, since now Thomas couldn't have a say in this. Then they told me that the intention of the video was to show that this is what they used to think of me back then when I first married Thomas. But now I was really a part of the family. They had accepted me, and apparently, they even had a big speech planned after that video where they were going to tell me how much they loved me and what I meant to them. They said that the intention of playing this video was to show how far we had come as a family. But I didn't buy it. I stormed out of the place, called Thomas, and demanded that he pick me up and take me back home. I explained everything to him on the phone, and since he already knew what video I was talking about, he got everything instantly, and I didn't have to waste much time. After I was done with the phone call, Donna and Erica came running out of the venue after me to convince me to stay and kept asking me to forgive them. They didn't consider how I would feel on watching this video. They were only thinking about how heartfelt this would seem, but now they realized that this was a stupid idea. They kept telling me that they didn't mean to hurt me, but that meant nothing to me because I had trusted them with my baby shower. And they had completely shattered all the trust I had put in them by planning to play that video. I told them to back off, but they didn't listen to me and kept trying to get me to stay. So I finally just snapped and told them that I wasn't interested in whatever they planned for me because now I knew what they really thought of me. And I didn't believe them even for a second when they said that they were going to make a speech about how much they loved me afterwards. I'd also yelled at them that I wasn't just a baby carrier and I was my own person. So if it took a pregnancy to make them approve of me, then I didn't need that approval at all. And we could go back to not having a relationship like before, because I would prefer that rather than being a part of their fake and pretentious little club. I told both of them that neither of them would have amounted to anything had it not been for my father-in-law, who supported Donna even though she was pathetic at her job and almost got fired. But her husband made his brother hire her as an accountant so she'd still have a job without having to work too hard. And he got Erica a spot at the best business school in the city, even though she didn't have the grades for it. And he needed to use his connections to get her in. Neither of them knew about these things, and only Thomas and his father were aware of it. But he's told me these family secrets a long time back to make me feel better after a particularly horrible dinner at his parents' house where Donna and Erica wouldn't stop mocking me. Their faces fell when I brought that up, and they looked even more upset when I told them that they had absolutely nothing to be so proud and arrogant about because if they had to face the same kind of struggles in their lives as I had to, then they probably wouldn't be so smug. Living a life like mine would have broken both their flimsy little spirits, and they had no right to question me, especially given their own incompetence. In the meantime, Thomas pulled up, and I got into his car, and then we left the venue without any further discussion. They still tried to talk to me while I was leaving, but I rolled up my windows and we drove away. Thomas had heard the last part where I was yelling at them and talking about whatever my father-in-law had done for them, and he told me that he didn't think it was a good idea for me to tell them about it. I didn't reply to that, and he didn't bring it up later. Of course, the party and everything had to be canceled at the very last moment because I wasn't even there, and nobody apart from my mom knew the real reason why until my husband told his relatives to explain why the event had to be called off. Most of them are on my side, which means that Erica and Donna don't have anybody. I thought that I did the right thing, including me bringing up how the two of them had so much help that I didn't, and they were judging me because they came from a place of privilege and could afford to pass judgments on someone that they knew absolutely nothing about. I didn't hear from either of them for a couple of days, and Thomas and I didn't discuss it either. He apologized to me on behalf of his family, but that was about it, and we didn't talk about it anymore because it's not like this was his fault. However, a couple of days ago, I received a letter from my father-in-law, Raymond. We usually get along well, and he didn't have the problems with me that his wife and daughters seem to have. But this time, he was furious because of the secrets that I revealed to Donna and Erica. He told me that it was absolutely not my place to tell them about something like this, which he had decided to keep from them for so long for the sake of their own self-esteem. Now, I hadn't done all the work that he had put in, and both of them were totally miserable just because I decided to make them feel bad about themselves and get back at them. I tried to defend myself by telling him what they'd been planning to do, and I believe that what I said was completely justified because they'd been picking on me for years before I finally snapped. He told me that he could understand that I was upset, but it was still not my place to bring that up, and he was extremely disappointed in me. We haven't spoken since then, and when I try to talk to Thomas about it, he says that he has nothing to say. But I think he is dodging the question because he feels the same way as his father. So I decided I was not going to apologize to Donna and Erica because I really don't think I said anything out of line. They've been picking on me ever since they met me, and this time I finally decided to snap at them and let them know exactly what I thought of them. They can't always get away with everything that they say and do just because Thomas and Raymond believe that this would make them feel bad about themselves. Over the years, there have been several instances where the two of them have ganged up against me and made me feel bad. But nobody's talking about that. So why is it such a big deal if I do the same thing to them that they've been doing to me for years? I also told Thomas about how I felt because I sensed that he agreed with his father. Now I couldn't care less about what Raymond thinks, but I need my husband to be on my side. So far, he's always maintained the peace of the family by telling me to ignore whatever his mother and sisters say. But I feel like he needs to realize that I'm his wife, and he needs to stand up for me. I told him that he cannot have this diplomatic approach to things between me and them anymore because that's unfair to all of us, and he needs to pick a side. I was afraid that he would disagree with me or fight with me over this, but he agreed wholeheartedly and even apologized to me for being too scared to do the right thing. He confessed that he was afraid that if he stood up for me and fought with his mom and sister, he would be ostracized from the family, and they mean a lot to him despite their behavior. So he was afraid of standing up for me. But he did realize now that he had a duty towards me as well and couldn't just always expect me to suck it up and keep ignoring every little thing that they did just because I was stronger than them. It wasn't fair to me, and he'd come to the conclusion that he was going to cut his family off. I was touched because I know what family means to him, but I guess now it's about time that there are some real consequences to Donna and Erica's actions, because I still haven't forgiven them for whatever I saw in that video, and they haven't even apologized to me or reached out to me after I left that day, which is fine by me because I don't want them to do that either. I don't think it will fix anything, and it will probably just piss me off even more. Some of you in the comments said that I was overreacting because it was just meant to be a roast, and they were going to make it up to me by giving a heartfelt speech afterwards. But that means nothing to me. I'm sure that there are a lot of better ways to show your love to a heavily pregnant woman at her baby shower than a roast video, especially when you know that they meant everything that they said, and they're not just kidding. So I don't think that I'm overreacting. This is the perfect reaction. I didn't even ask them to host it for me. They were the ones who offered to take over, only to let me down in the end. I feel betrayed and hurt, and that's not going to go anywhere. So now that it's been a week since the baby shower incident, and we haven't been talking to Thomas's family, I thought that things had finally cooled down a bit. But I guess Erica isn't okay with that. I hadn't blocked anybody because I honestly just forgot that we could do that. So I got a text from her early this morning where she started off pretty well and apologized to me because they hadn't thought things through while preparing for the baby shower. But then she said that she wanted an apology from me for both her and Donna because she believed that what I said was out of line. I could hardly believe the audacity to ask me for an apology after what I saw that day, and especially after the way they'd been treating me for the past couple of years. They never even gave me a chance and just assumed I was a gold digger without bothering to even get to know me. At least the things that I said about them were true. Erica said in her text that it was not my place to say things like that about them, and even if they did come from a place of privilege, it was none of my business. Which was just so ironic because they'd always made it a point to remind me where I came from. And now these were the same people saying that it was none of my business where they came from. To them, my being poor was an actual problem, and they just couldn't accept the fact that I didn't come from a financially wealthy background like they did. They felt free to criticize me for it all they wanted to, but now that they're getting a taste of their own bitter medicine, they don't like it. I treated that text as a joke because honestly, what was I even supposed to say to that? It was a ridiculously entitled and tone-deaf thing to say, which is what I expected of Erica, so I'm honestly not surprised. I know they wanted an apology, and I probably should have responded with something snarky or mean to put them in their place, but it just didn't seem worth it. If I replied to them, that would just lead to more, and that's the last thing that I needed. So I ignored it because Thomas was right. The only thing that I could do was ignore them and hope that they would go away. It's kind of sad because I actually believed that we were becoming friends over the course of my pregnancy. But evidently, I was mistaken. These two idiots are too stupid to actually be friends with anyone apart from like-minded idiots. I haven't told Thomas about this yet because he hasn't come home from work. But as soon as he does, I'm going to fill him in and see what he has to say about Erica sending me this text. We haven't been discussing them at all ever since the last update, so I think it's been a couple of days now, and it sucks that I have to bring it up again because I know he's hurting. However, I have no choice, and I know that we have to talk about this and come to a conclusion about what we can do about it because when the baby comes, I don't want us to be fighting over what we need to do about his family and whether they should be allowed to have a relationship with the baby or not. We have to discuss it, and we have to talk about them. My last update was just a couple of hours ago, and it feels funny to be back so soon. But this is important, and I need to talk about this, so here I am. Thomas and I talked about Erica and her text after dinner. Once he was well rested and well fed, I asked him if he thinks they should be allowed to see the baby once we have him because at the rate things are going with his family, I don't think I want to stay in touch with them. I want to make no contact, at least until they actually come to their senses and apologize to me. He thought about it for a while and then told me that it was my call entirely because I was the one that they'd been disrespecting all along. So now it was up to me if I wanted them around the baby or not. He said that while he personally would want to stay in touch with his family and try to work things out between us to clear the air eventually, he knew that it was not his place to make that decision for me, so whatever I say goes. I thought that it was pretty sweet of him to leave it completely up to me, and he did have a point too. Thomas also mentioned that I was the one who was pregnant. I was the one going through so much, and so it would be his duty to make sure that I'm well taken care of because right now, his new family is his priority. So he left it up to me what we should do about his family. I told him that I was going to take some time to think about it and then let him know eventually. It's too soon for me to come to a decision right now. Update 4. I guess I made my decision. I don't think I'm going to allow Thomas's crazy family around me or my child anymore. I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but now I know that they are incapable of change, and I don't want my baby around them in any capacity. Thomas had a day off today, and he was staying at home with me to spend some quality time, which was really lucky for me. Today, all three, Erica, Donna, and Raymond, showed up at the house to have a discussion with me about my behavior. They claimed that they were here to discuss things, but it felt more like an ambush, and I was really lucky to have Thomas there because he nipped it in the bud and told them all to go home since I wasn't willing to speak to them. Erica was the one who was the most angry about all of this, and I could hear them all arguing on the front steps. She was telling him that the only reason that they'd ever doubted me and my intentions was because they were looking out for him since I didn't come from a financially stable background. They didn't want him to get stuck with a gold digger, which is why they've been giving me such a hard time. I was furious and almost went to the porch to argue with them myself. But Thomas handled it pretty well and tore them a new one. He called them a lot of names that I don't want to repeat here, told them off, and even informed them that when the baby was here, they wouldn't be allowed to see any of us because they were disrespectful and were blatantly crossing all boundaries possible. After a couple of minutes, Raymond intervened and told Thomas that he was cutting him out of the family until he came to his senses and divorced me because I was apparently leading him away from them. And then they left. Thomas seemed relieved when he came back to me, and we spent the rest of the afternoon just talking and making fun of everybody behind their backs. So I'd say that this was a great day, and I'm pretty content with how things turned out. Before delving into anything else, I want to shed light on my relationship with my sister. There's an age gap of 11 years between us. I'm currently 36, while she turned 25 this year. Her arrival wasn't exactly planned, much like mine. Our parents had me when they were just 20, so my sister's appearance 11 years later came as a surprise. Being the youngest in the family, she was indulged and pampered excessively during her childhood. Despite our age difference, I never harbored any jealousy towards her. In fact, I often spoiled her myself. Both my parents and I are dentists by profession, a path I chose out of genuine interest. When my sister expressed her desire to pursue acting, I supported her wholeheartedly. Convincing our parents to let her enroll in film school was no easy feat. They deemed it an unstable career choice reliant on luck. However, I believed in her talent and assured them of my support, even if her acting aspirations didn't pan out. This wasn't the first time I advocated for her. During her teenage years, I often persuaded our parents to let her attend parties, stay out late, or go on trips, ensuring she experienced life to the fullest. My devotion to her knew no bounds. I'd even shoulder the blame for her mistakes. Such was my affection for my little sister. Unfortunately, my well-intentioned actions seemed to have had unintended consequences. Despite our hopes that she would outgrow her brash demeanor, she only became more insolent and self-centered over the years. Nevertheless, she managed to secure a proposal from her boyfriend of 2 years, now her husband. I wasn't invited to the wedding due to a trivial disagreement, a decision that stung deeply. Despite this, I remained the most enthusiastic about her impending nuptials. She reached out to me first after the proposal, and in the following weeks, I dedicated myself to helping plan the extravagant affair she desired. Despite her struggles as an actress, she dreamt of a grand celebration, one she couldn't afford alone. My parents were generously covering my sister's wedding expenses, and her boyfriend's affluent family also contributed. With her husband's stable engineering job, financial concerns weren't pressing. I'd offered to cover her wedding dress expenses, hoping she'd opt for something sensible. Additionally, a friend owned a bridal boutique and offered us discounted rates. Initially, my sister agreed to this arrangement. However, she later expressed a desire for a designer gown costing $8,000. While I typically wouldn't object, I had already planned to fund her honeymoon as a gift. She had always dreamt of a comprehensive European tour, and I intended to surprise her with precisely that after the wedding. Given the considerable expense of the honeymoon, I hesitated to spend an additional $8,000 solely on a dress she'd wear just once. I explained my stance to my sister, highlighting that while the designer gown was extravagant, the honeymoon would create lasting memories. I suggested alternatives, such as purchasing a similar dress from my friend's boutique at a more reasonable price. However, she remained adamant about her preference for the designer label. Our disagreement over the wedding dress led to a standoff, with my sister sulking and refusing to bid me farewell when I left that day. I anticipated she'd eventually come around, but days passed without any communication. Though I had initially intended to surprise her with the details of her dream honeymoon, her prolonged silence prompted me to consider explaining my rationale for refusing the extravagant dress. After nearly a week of silence, I contemplated reaching out, but before I could, she called me. I expected an apology for her immature behavior, but instead, she launched into accusations, questioning why I was being cheap. Her words cut deep, particularly her jab about my lack of a family. It struck a nerve because my decision to remain single and childless was a deliberate one, and her insensitivity stung, especially coming from my own sister. Her disregard for my feelings, despite knowing how sensitive I am about this topic, left me feeling hurt and betrayed. It seemed she was intentionally trying to provoke me. I found myself deeply offended by my sister's sudden change in attitude. This side of her, typically reserved for those she dislikes, had never been directed at me before. The shock of her demeanor shift caught me off guard, especially considering I had never denied her anything before. It was a complete turnaround simply because I refused to indulge her desire for an exorbitantly priced wedding gown. Expressing my displeasure, I reminded her that her disrespectful behavior was unwarranted, particularly since I was footing the bill for her dress. In response, she belittled my life choices, insinuating that buying things for her wedding was my attempt to fill my empty existence. She even went as far as calling me jealous of her impending marriage, emphasizing my single status as I approached 40. Unable to bear such disrespect, I ended the call abruptly. For the next few days, I nursed my wounds in silence, deeply hurt by her words. The sister I had supported and cared for was now using hurtful words against me over a trivial disagreement about a dress. Despite our parents' reassurances that things would eventually mend, I felt disheartened as the weeks passed without reconciliation. After 2 months of silence, the realization struck when I noticed the absence of a wedding invitation among our relatives. It dawned on me that our fight had severed our bond to the point where she had no intention of inviting me to her wedding. I took the situation to heart, feeling deeply hurt by my sister's actions. Despite always going the extra mile to make her happy, I found myself treated with disrespect. Even for her wedding, I was prepared to spare no expense, intending to sponsor the honeymoon of her dreams. However, upon realizing I hadn't received an invitation to her wedding, I grappled with disappointment for some time. Eventually, I came to terms with the reality of my sister's character. She exhibited traits of narcissism and self-centeredness, incapable of genuine care or love unless there was something in it for her. With this realization, I made the decision to cut ties, blocking her from all my social platforms and ceasing communication. However, during a dinner with my parents a couple of months ago, fueled by champagne, I confessed the true reason behind my refusal to buy her the extravagant dress and my intention to gift her a Europe trip. Although I later sobered up and made my parents promise not to disclose this to my sister, they broke their word. On the morning of her wedding, my sister unexpectedly appeared at my door. Startled and unprepared, I hesitated to let her in. Instead, I called her to inquire about her sudden visit. She politely requested entry, but I stood my ground, refusing to entertain her presence. Despite her attempts to reconcile, I couldn't overlook the disrespect she had shown me. Her sudden change of heart puzzled me, leading me to suspect our mother had divulged the details of the original gift I had planned for her. Confirming my suspicions, she admitted to knowing about my intended surprise, expressing remorse for her past behavior and extending an invitation to her wedding as a gesture of reconciliation. If only she had chosen to deny any knowledge of the gift and expressed genuine remorse for her actions, perhaps I would have reconsidered. But instead, she lacked the foresight to fabricate a plausible excuse and confessed to being motivated solely by the revelation of the intended gift. It was a bitter realization that had our mother not disclosed this information, she wouldn't have bothered inviting me to her wedding either. Her insistence on making amends fell on deaf ears as I stood firm in my decision to keep her at bay. Despite her protests and pleas, I remained resolute, unwilling to entertain her attempts at reconciliation. Her audacity to suggest that I couldn't dismiss her presence on her wedding day only fueled my frustration. I snapped, informing her that her last-minute invitation held no significance for me, and I had no intention of attending her wedding. As she continued to argue over the phone, insisting on the importance of her personal invitation, I chose to end the conversation once more. However, her outburst outside my door, hurling insults and even kicking it, only exacerbated the situation. Though tempted to involve the authorities, the early hour and my grogginess dissuaded me, opting instead to return to sleep and address the matter with my mother later. It was a struggle to shake off the lingering upset as I tried to drift back into sleep. Finally succumbing to exhaustion, I managed to doze off, only to be jolted awake by the incessant buzzing of my phone. Groggily, I answered the call from an unfamiliar number, thinking it might be work-related. To my dismay, it was my sister's husband on the line. Without preamble, he launched into a tirade, joined by their friends, hurling insults and laughter my way. Stunned by the onslaught, I could barely comprehend their words amidst the cacophony of abuse. After enduring the verbal assault for what felt like an eternity, I hung up in disbelief. Minutes later, I called my mother, seeking answers. She confessed to revealing the details of the intended honeymoon to my sister the evening before the wedding, hoping it would prompt her to seek reconciliation. Regrettably, her actions backfired, and I found myself subjected to further humiliation. My mother was unaware of the phone call, as she had been outside with her friends, taking photos. She expressed shock and remorse at their behavior, but I couldn't share her sentiment. This petty and spiteful display was characteristic of my sister, and I found myself seething with anger, not just towards her, but also towards my mother for her misguided intervention. For the next few hours, I stewed in my room, silently fuming and plotting my next move. Anger simmered within me, directed not just at my sister, but at my mother as well. Despite my mother's well-meaning intentions, I couldn't shake off the feeling of betrayal and humiliation. However, I recognized her genuine desire to mend things, and in time, I forgave her. Yet, my sister's behavior demanded a response. Resorting to legal action seemed futile and would only cast me as the villain. Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Channeling my frustration and spite, I impulsively booked tickets for a European adventure, inviting a friend to join me. It wasn't solely an act of retaliation, but also a personal endeavor to inject some excitement into my life. I had always played it safe, shying away from spontaneity, but this trip was a departure from that pattern. As my friend and I embarked on our journey, I documented our experiences on social media, fully aware that word would eventually reach my sister. Purposefully keeping mutual connections intact, I ensured she would learn of my exploits. True to expectation, news of my travels reached her, leaving her devastated. While my actions achieved the desired effect, eliciting remorse from my sister, I couldn't ignore the backlash from others. My mother, in particular, admonished me for being petty and failing to consider the significant age gap between us before proceeding with my plan. Her words struck a chord, and I couldn't shake the feeling of regret. Despite my sister's remorse and the sympathy from those around me, I couldn't escape the nagging guilt. As the dust settled, I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions, questioning the righteousness of my actions, and feeling remorseful for the pain I had caused. In hindsight, I realized that perhaps I had gone too far in seeking retribution, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being a jerk. Update 1. Firstly, I want to express my gratitude for all the supportive comments and reassurance. Your kindness truly means a lot to me, especially during this difficult time. Some of you have pointed out that I may have been foolish in my actions towards my sister, and I agree. I realize now that I went overboard in trying to please her and ended up spoiling her more than she deserved. I suppose I was somewhat of a pushover because I believed that family would never treat me poorly, but I've learned otherwise. Additionally, I've come to recognize the unfair treatment I've received from my parents, particularly due to our significant age gap. Just because I'm 11 years older doesn't mean my feelings are any less valid. It's frustrating that my parents have chosen to intervene now that my sister is upset, despite taking a step back when I needed their support earlier. Although I haven't confronted them about this yet, I plan to address it if my mother reaches out to me again. It's been 4 days since our last conversation, and while I anticipate she may contact me soon, I'm prepared to discuss my concerns with her. During our last phone call, I noticed my father whispering to my mother, indicating he had thoughts to share but refrained from doing so to avoid adding to the drama. While I didn't mention it previously, given the current circumstances, I feel compelled to vent and express my frustrations. I'm still on my trip, putting on a brave face when I'm out with my friend to avoid dampening his spirits. However, internally, I'm grappling with a whirlwind of emotions and feeling pretty upset about the entire situation. Update 2. After nearly 3 weeks of silence, my mother finally reached out to me, not to apologize, but to inform me that my parents had decided it would be best if we didn't meet for a while to avoid upsetting my sister. It's apparent that my feelings hold little importance to them. Adding insult to injury, she revealed that they were sponsoring my sister's trip to Barrie, further highlighting their blatant favoritism. I couldn't help but sarcastically commend my mother for her sudden proactive maternal behavior, albeit at the expense of meddling in my sister's affairs. I expressed my wish for her to have shown the same concern for me when I was struggling with my sister's silent treatment over a trivial matter like a dress, and then promptly ended the call. Shortly after, my father reached out via text, admonishing my behavior towards my mother and insisting I rectify the situation if we were to maintain a semblance of a relationship. I tersely dismissed his admonitions, blocking him without further ado. I've resolved not to allow my family to disrupt my holiday any longer. Fighting for their attention seems futile, especially at my age. I refuse to be dragged into the high school-like drama orchestrated by my sister and enabled by my parents. Having invested a significant sum into this tour, I'm determined to make the most of it. While I hadn't confided in my friend about the familial turmoil until now, today I decided to open up to him. He reassured me that the issue lies not with me, but with my family's favoritism towards my sister. His words were a much-needed reality check, affirming that it's time for me to extricate myself from this toxic dynamic. For too long, I've harbored hope that my family would come around, but now I understand that's unlikely and I'm finally at peace with it. Update 3. I'm back from my European adventure after almost 6 weeks of exploring the streets of various countries. I don't want to come across as preachy, but this trip has truly transformed me and reshaped my outlook on life. I feel like a completely different person now, which is probably why I'm not bothered by the fact that my parents have disinherited me. It's okay. I have enough income to support myself. On a happier note, something unexpected happened during the trip. My friend, the one I traveled with, and I are now together. It happened about a week ago when we were sharing a bottle of wine. He confessed that he had feelings for me for quite some time, and to my surprise, I realized that I felt the same way. We've been friends for almost 8 years, and while I had harbored feelings for him, I was afraid to ruin our friendship by admitting them. But now we're together, and I couldn't be happier. Reflecting on everything that has happened, the drama with my sister, the fallout with my parents, it all seems insignificant now. This vacation was exactly what I needed for myself, regardless of any desire for revenge or validation from my family. I'm genuinely grateful for the experience and the newfound happiness it has brought me. Just a week ago, I celebrated my 16th birthday alone, devoid of any party or celebration. My parents, in their usual indifferent manner, barely acknowledged the milestone before dropping a bombshell. I was to be kicked out of our family home. The catalyst? My older sister, Amanda, their apparent favorite, who at 22 was 7 months pregnant. In a house with 4 bedrooms, my parents decided I should vacate so the new arrival could have its own space. They presented this decision matter-of-factly, leaving me stunned by their lack of concern for me. Despite my low expectations, their callousness still managed to surprise me. They assured me they would continue to cover my expenses until I turned 18, but insisted I could no longer reside with them. I meekly questioned why the nursery couldn't be set up in the guest room, only to be told it was reserved for Amanda's boyfriend. It was a clear demonstration of their skewed priorities. My parents, Amanda and her partner, and soon the baby, all had designated rooms. Amanda's absence during this discussion seemed calculated to spare her guilt. Our relationship had always been distant due to the age gap, but I never expected her to endorse my eviction. Disappointed and hurt, especially on my birthday, I resigned myself to their decision without protest. Realizing that my parents' affection was beyond reach, I silently packed my belongings. They assisted, perhaps eager to expedite my departure. The car ride to my aunt's house was filled with their chatter, oblivious to my withdrawn demeanor. Upon arrival, they dropped me off without a hug or a kiss, leaving me to confront the reality of my familial rejection. My aunt greeted me with genuine warmth, appreciating my presence in a way my parents never seemed to. As we conversed, I confided in her about my disappointment with my parents' actions. Initially taken aback, her smile faded into a concerned frown as I recounted the morning's events. Without a word, she excused herself to make a phone call, leaving me to ponder her sudden change in demeanor. From the next room, I could hear her engaged in a heated argument, a rare occurrence for her typically soft-spoken nature. It was evident that my parents had stirred her ire. When she returned, her face flushed with frustration, I learned that my own father, her brother, had twisted the truth, claiming that I had willingly proposed the arrangement to accommodate the baby and was content with leaving home. My aunt, being single and uninterested in marriage or children, saw my presence as akin to having a roommate, easing any financial burden with my father covering my expenses. Believing that I desired this living arrangement, she readily agreed to take me in. It became clear that my father's deception had painted a false picture, manipulating my aunt's perception of the situation. Despite the betrayal, my aunt's affection for me remained steadfast, believing that I had willingly chosen to live with her. My aunt had initially agreed to take me in, but upon learning the truth, she called my dad to confront him. She was upset, and so was I. This situation felt uniquely difficult for someone my age. I'd always known my parents favored my sister, but this was extreme. They had lied to my aunt to cover up their actions, fully aware of how wrong it was. They prioritized accommodating my sister's boyfriend over my comfort, even though my sister could have easily lived with him. My parents insisted on keeping her close, even at my expense. Feeling deeply wounded, I made a decision to expose my parents' actions online. Uncertain if my aunt would support this, I waited for her to leave the room before pouring out my emotions into a post on my phone. In it, I detailed not only the events of that painful day, but also the long-standing unfair treatment I'd endured at home. As I typed, emotions overwhelmed me, and tears flowed freely. It wasn't just an exposure of my parents. It became a raw, emotional outpouring. After posting, fear gripped me, and I switched off my phone, dreading the repercussions. An hour passed in anxious anticipation, during which I attempted to distract myself with a book, though my mind couldn't focus. When my aunt awoke and rushed into the room where I sat, she calmly inquired about my post. Honestly, I admitted to her that I had indeed posted something, and our conversation ended there. Turning my phone back on, I discovered that my post had been seen by numerous family members, and my inbox was flooded with messages. Relatives expressed solidarity, offering support and encouragement. Their words lifted my spirits momentarily, until I braved my parents' messages. Filled with vitriol and anger, they demanded I remove the post. My father's texts were particularly hurtful, containing cruel words and even expressing regret for my existence. Unsurprisingly, my mother's texts echoed the same tone as my father's, while my sister's messages held a slight difference. She expressed a desire to speak to me in person, leaving it at that. Feeling overwhelmed by the flood of messages, I set my phone aside without responding to anyone for the next couple of days. However, I made the decision to block my parents, as I had no desire to engage with them further. While legally obligated to provide for me until I turned 18, I felt no need for further communication. My aunt supported my decision, and in the days that followed, there was no indication that my father attempted to contact her. We maintained a facade of normalcy, pretending as though nothing had occurred. Knowing she stood by me was all the support I needed. For a week, I distanced myself from my parents until the day they unexpectedly appeared outside my school. My friends, aware of the situation, formed a protective barrier around me as my parents yelled my name. Reluctantly, I approached them and made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with them anymore. Ignoring my refusal, my parents insisted that I accompany them home immediately. Confused by their sudden change in attitude, I questioned their motives. It seemed clear to me that their sudden concern was more about salvaging their reputation within the family rather than genuine care for me. Refusing to comply until they provided an explanation, I demanded to know why they were acting this way all of a sudden. Despite their evident frustration, they persisted in their request for me to return home. Concerned about my friends overhearing our conversation, they urged me to speak with them in private. Once alone, my parents revealed their true intentions. They admitted that their sudden urgency stemmed from my lack of response to their calls and texts. Furthermore, they disclosed that they needed me back home to secure their inheritance. The fallout from my online post had spread throughout the family, reaching even my paternal grandparents. Aware of their financial leverage, My grandparents threatened to revoke my father's inheritance if they continued mistreating me. They were warned that unless they made efforts to reconcile with me, treat me with kindness, and ensure my well-being, my father's potential inheritance would go to my aunt, who had been graciously caring for me despite having no obligation to do so. Losing this inheritance was not an option for my parents, given its significant value. While they had a decent combined income of their own, the inheritance held considerable importance. I understood their concern, but their attempts to frame their actions as a favor to me rather than a self-serving endeavor were transparent. Disregarding their pleas and protests, I made it clear that their inheritance mattered little to me. Walking away from their screams, I returned to my aunt's house, where I recounted the ordeal. Seeing her annoyance, she took action to prevent a repeat of such incidents. Contacting her lawyer, we began exploring options to secure my custody and ensure that my well-being remained a priority. Certainly, the legal aspect of my parents' rights over me would need to be addressed if I were to live with my aunt permanently. I expressed my gratitude to my grandparents for their efforts to resolve the situation, but I made it clear that returning to my parents' home was not something I desired. Having spent a few days under my aunt's care, I finally experienced a sense of freedom that had eluded me while living with my parents. Living with them had felt suffocating, and despite my hopes for change, nothing improved. While my grandparents didn't witness the reality of my home life firsthand due to living in a different city, my parents always presented a facade of good behavior during family gatherings and holidays. Beneath the surface, however, I was often overlooked and neglected, particularly after my sister's pregnancy. My presence felt insignificant compared to my sister's, and as time passed, I found myself increasingly marginalized. I shared all of this with my grandparents, and they assured me that if living with my aunt was truly what I wanted, they would make it happen. They promised to ensure that all my needs would be taken care of, even if my parents relinquished their rights. It was a relief to hear such support, and for a moment, it felt like things were finally turning in my favor. However, the peace didn't last long. Just a few hours ago, I received an email from my dad. It wasn't filled with hate or anger, but rather disappointment. He expressed that airing our family matters online wasn't necessary, especially when my aunt could have relayed the information to my grandparents. Now, not only were my grandparents upset with them, but they were also facing backlash and ostracization from relatives. He lamented that even some of his coworkers had become aware of the situation, tarnishing his reputation at work. In his view, my actions had caused unnecessary drama in their lives. Update 1. Firstly, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who took the time to comment on my post. Your kind words mean a lot to me, and I am truly thankful for your support. Now, let me address some of the questions that many of you seem to have regarding why I didn't leave my parents' house sooner and why I waited for them to ask me to leave, especially when my grandparents and aunt seemed willing to help. As I mentioned in the original post, I was never treated poorly by my parents. However, I often felt overlooked and neglected, which in its own way constitutes mistreatment. Despite this, I convinced myself that I was doing fine because I wasn't subjected to physical abuse or verbal cruelty. I had shelter and food, so I suppressed the need to feel loved or valued. The neglect had become so normalized for me that I didn't even realize it was happening. Additionally, I hesitated to seek help from my family because I didn't want to burden them. I'd also feared the repercussions if my parents found out. They place a great deal of importance on appearances, and I worried that seeking help would only exacerbate the situation at home. So, I suffered in silence, keeping everything to myself. Regarding my aunt, she didn't offer to take me in earlier because she didn't want to offend my parents, and she wasn't sure if I would even want to live with her. However, now that circumstances have led to this organic outcome, everything seems to be falling into place. She is currently in discussions with a lawyer to transfer my custody rights to her, although it will undoubtedly be a challenging process given the stakes involved. Since my original post, I received an email from my dad expressing disappointment in my decision to make our family matters public. He felt that it had caused unnecessary drama in their lives. However, my grandparents intervened, informing me that my parents would no longer bother me and reassuring me that I needn't worry about them showing up at my school or contacting me again. As for my sister, she reached out to me after my post, expressing regret for not speaking up on my behalf and apologizing for her role in our strained relationship. She explained that she had never felt comfortable confronting our parents and was shocked to learn about the living arrangement that led to my eviction. She had planned to move out eventually, but was forced to accelerate her plans after the fallout from my post. Despite the drama, she apologized for being a bad sister and pledged to support me moving forward. It's been less than a week since my original post, and I haven't heard from my parents since the email. It seems they've given up on trying to bring me back home, likely influenced by my grandparents. While I'm unsure of the details of their conversation, I'm relieved to know that my parents won't be interfering in my life anymore. Update 2. Just 3 days have passed since my last update, and today my aunt informed me that my parents have agreed to relinquish their parental rights. The necessary paperwork is in progress, and soon my aunt will officially take over the legal aspect of my custody. I have mixed feelings about this development. On one hand, I'm relieved that I'll finally have a home where I feel wanted and valued. However, there's also a sense of emptiness and sadness. It's strange that this is finally happening, but deep down, I know it's for the best. This is what I've wanted all along. Update 3. Hey, everyone. It's been a couple of weeks since my aunt became my legal guardian, so that's a positive step forward. I recently learned that my parents agreed to give up my custody because my grandparents gave them an ultimatum. They could either lose their entire inheritance or retain half of it, while relinquishing my custody and promising not to interfere with my life again. It's no surprise they chose the latter option. Frankly, I'm not bothered by their decision. It feels like I've dodged a bullet, and I'm glad to be free from their influence. I'm still in touch with my sister, though my parents are attempting to reconcile with her before her due date. However, she's requested some space for herself at the moment, urging them to stop pressuring her. It's almost comical how they managed to create such a mess in our family. Nonetheless, I'm content with my aunt, and that's what truly matters to me now. I'm Hannah, and if you were to ask me, my life follows a pretty standard routine. A decent job, a reliable husband named Mark who's been my rock since college, and 2 kids who are a mix of sweetness and mischief. But one thing I've come to realize is that normalcy is fragile, especially with a brother like Alex. Alex is 8 years my junior, the type who seems to resist growing up. He switches jobs and girlfriends as if he's changing TV channels, yet he has a habit of turning to mom or me whenever his wallet feels light, which is all too often. So there we were gathered at mom's for our usual Sunday dinner. The aroma of roast filled the house, and the kids were their usual energetic selves. Then, the door slammed open, and in walked Alex, accompanied by a girl who seemed more suited to a beach than a family gathering. Her dress was so short that Mark nearly choked on his tea when he saw her. "Family, meet Lisa," Alex announced proudly, as if introducing a prize. "My fiancé. And guess what? We're expecting a baby." Silence enveloped the room. Mark coughed violently, Mom froze with her mouth half open, and I just stared, internally sighing. "Here we go again. Alex, are you out of your mind?" I couldn't help myself. I blurted out. "You can barely take care of yourself." Lisa, hands on her hips, regarded me with disdain. "We're very happy, thank you. And we don't need negativity, right, babe?" Alex nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah, we're doing great." Mom struggled to find her words. "Congratulations, but Alex, have you thought this through? A baby is a big responsibility." "Of course he hasn't," I muttered, earning glares from both of them. "Listen, Hannah," Alex shot back. "I don't need a lecture from you. We'll be fine, right, Lisa?" "Absolutely," Lisa agreed, adding, "and we'll need some help, obviously, starting with living here for a while." "Living here?" I exclaimed. "With Mom? Are you kidding?" Lisa snapped. It's not like we have anywhere else to go. And it's not forever, just until Alex finds a new job. And when will that be? I retorted sarcastically. You planning on job hunting between gaming sessions? Alex shrugged nonchalantly. I'll figure it out. I always do. Mom tried to smooth things over, saying, well, we'll make do. We always do, right, Hannah? I looked at her, seeing the resignation in her eyes, and sighed, yeah, Mom, we always do. Dinner was tense after that. Mark kept giving me apprehensive looks, anticipating the storm he knew was brewing. And I was trying to comprehend the chaos my life was about to descend into. After dinner, while the kids played and Mark helped Mom with the dishes, I confronted Alex in the living room. You can't keep doing this, I admonished. Dumping your problems on Mom, on me. It's not fair. Alex, lounging as if he owned the place, just shrugged. What do you want me to say, Hannah? Life's tough. I'm doing my best. Your best? I seethed, dragging a pregnant girl into this mess, expecting everyone else to pick up your slack. Watch how you talk about us, Lisa yelled from the kitchen. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Arguing wouldn't solve anything, not with Alex, not now. Just try to think about someone other than yourself for once, I pleaded, feeling more exhausted than angry. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in Alex's eyes. But then he smiled that carefree, reckless smile of his. We'll manage, sis, we always do. As I went to help with the dishes, leaving Alex to his illusions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all teetering on the edge of something significant, and not in a good way. But, as Mom said, we'd make do because that's what families do, right? Even when they're on the brink of being turned upside down by one of their own. Having Alex and Lisa move in was akin to inviting a hurricane into your house and hoping it only waters the plants. From day one, the balance of our family home was thrown off. Mom tried to maintain a positive attitude, but I could see the strain in her eyes. One morning, I dropped by to see Mom, and the scene was chaotic. Dishes piled up, laundry forgotten, and Lisa lounging on the couch as if it were her throne, absorbed in her phone. Alex was nowhere to be seen, probably asleep or pretending to be. Morning, Lisa, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Need help with anything? She barely glanced up. Oh no, I'm good. Just resting, for the baby. The baby? I echoed, surveying the mess and Alex. He's asleep maybe. I don't keep tabs on him. Of course not, she replied casually. Why start now? I sighed and began picking up. Mom entered, her smile forced. Hannah, you don't have to do that. I don't mind. Can't have you dealing with all this alone, I insisted. Lisa watched us, unmoving. You're so good to your mom, she remarked, and I couldn't discern if she was being sarcastic. Somebody's got to be, I muttered, throwing her a glance. She just smiled, unruffled. Later, I found Alex in the kitchen raiding the fridge. Nice of you to join the living, I snapped. Your fiancée's made herself right at home. He grabbed a soda without meeting my eyes. Yeah, well, she's pregnant, needs to rest. And you, what's your excuse? Leaning against the counter, he adopted a casual stance. I'm looking for work, all right. It's not easy out there. Could have fooled me, I retorted. Seems like your full-time job is avoiding responsibility. He rolled his eyes, cracking open his soda. Why you always gotta be on my case, Hannah? I'm handling it. By handling, you mean letting Mom clean up after you too? I shot back. He didn't have an answer to that, just sipped his soda and shrugged. The final straw came when Lisa announced they wanted a small wedding at the house. Nothing fancy, she said, laying out plans that sounded anything but. Just something memorable. I looked at Mom, who was trying to hide her worry. And how do you plan to pay for this small wedding? Alex jumped in. We thought Mom could help, as a gift. I laughed, incredulous. You're joking, right? You want more from her. Lisa stood up, hands on her hips. It's not like we're asking for much, just a little help. A little help? I was fuming now. You've done nothing but take since you got here. Mom's on a fixed income, and you're planning a wedding like she's made of money. Alex tried to intervene. Hannah, come on, it's just. No, Alex, enough is enough, I interrupted. You two need to start taking responsibility for your own lives. Mom's not your personal ATM. Lisa's face went red, and for a moment, I thought she'd yell, but she just scoffed. Fine, we'll figure it out ourselves. Yeah, I said, heading for the door. You do that. I told Mom, don't let them bully you into paying for anything. It's time they learned the value of money. Mom nodded, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to help Alex, but knew it wasn't helping in the long run. That night, Mark and I talked it over. You can't keep fighting their battles, Hannah, he said, and I knew he was right. But it wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about protecting Mom from being taken advantage of. The next day, I made it clear to Alex and Lisa. You're adults. It's time to act like it. No more handouts. If you want a wedding, a life, you work for it. Their response was a mix of shock and anger, but I stood firm. This was the wake-up call they needed, whether they appreciated it or not. The addition of a new family member should have been a joyous occasion, and in a way it was. Lisa gave birth to a beautiful boy, a bundle of joy that brought a rare smile to everyone's faces, especially Mom's. She was over the moon, completely taken with her new grandson. But the joy was a double-edged sword. It was Mom, not Alex or Lisa, who ended up doing most of the caring for the little one. Watching her juggle her grandson alongside everything else was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Alex and Lisa's approach to parenting was, let's just say, hands off. While Mom cooed and cuddled the baby, Alex was glued to his computer screen, and Lisa was out more often than not, treating them all like her personal playground. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Life at Mom's had spiraled into a daily soap opera, minus the scripted resolution at the end of each episode. On one of my visits, I caught Mom poring over a pile of receipts that could easily be mistaken for a novel, with expenses that made my eyes water. Designer outfits, jewelry, luxury items that screamed extravagance from miles away. And there was Alex, engrossed in his virtual world, oblivious to the real one crumbling around him, his newborn son a mere background to his gaming adventures. Alex, isn't it about time you hit pause and maybe, I don't know, looked for a job? My attempt at lightheartedness did nothing to pierce his focus. He grunted something unintelligible, not once tearing his gaze from the screen. Working on it, he mumbled, the same old song and dance. And Lisa, I gestured to the mountain of receipts. This isn't exactly helping, she shrugged, a gesture that conveyed a universe of indifference. I rounded on Mom. How can you just sit by and watch them drain you like this? Mom sighed, a sound so heavy it seemed to carry the weight of the world. It's only money, Hannah. I can't lose my grandson over it. That's when Lisa waltzed in, arms laden with shopping bags, a triumphant grin plastered across her face. Nothing like a little retail therapy, she announced, dropping her spoils on the table as if she'd returned from a successful hunt. Therapy? More like grand larceny, I muttered. Mom can't keep this up, Lisa, I said, my voice firm. Her eyes narrowed to slits, her voice cold and sharp as ice. And neither can you? Perhaps we should just leave then. Let's see how often Mom gets to see her grandson after that. The thread hung in the air like a toxic cloud, threatening to choke us all. I looked to Mom for a sign of outrage, but she met my gaze with a resigned shake of her head, a silent plea to drop it. Later, in the sanctuary of the kitchen, I tried again. You can't let them use you like this, Mom. It's not right. She continued her tea ritual, a calming contrast to the storm brewing in my chest. I know, dear, but what choice do I have? That's my grandson. There has to be a line, Mom. They're walking all over you. She handed me a cup of tea, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity rarely seen. I'll handle it, Hannah. Trust me. I've got this under control. Control. The word tasted bitter. Seems more like they're controlling you, I said. She patted my hand, a gesture meant to soothe. Just trust me, dear. As I left, the image of Alex lost in another world, while Lisa admired her latest shiny trinket nod at me. Mom might think she had a handle on things, but from where I stood, it looked like we were all being dragged down by their weight. The trouble started when Mom got sick. Out of nowhere, one day she was fine. The next she was rushed to the hospital with what turned out to be a serious condition. I was there in a heartbeat, barely had time to grab my purse before I was out the door. The hospital became my second home, sitting by her bed, holding her hand, and praying she'd pull through. I called Alex, tried to get through to him and Lisa, telling them, Mom's sick. She's in the hospital. You need to come now. But all I got back were excuses. We're a bit tied up right now, Hannah. You know how it is? Alex would say, or Lisa would chime in with. We've got plans already. Can't just drop everything. Plans. Their social calendar was apparently more important than their sick mother lying in a hospital bed. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't understand how they could just carry on with their lives, partying and living it up while Mom was fighting for hers. I was running on fumes between my job, the kids, and now this. But I didn't have the luxury of being tied up or having plans. Mom needed me. So that's where I was, every day, hoping for some improvement, for her to wake up and tell me everything would be okay. 2 months of this hell, and then just as suddenly as she fell ill, she was gone. I was there, holding her hand, telling her I loved her, that I'd look after everything, not to worry. And where were Alex and Lisa? Out living their lives without a care in the world, not even bothering to see if Mom, or their son for that matter, needed them. The funeral was a blur of faces, condolences, and the overwhelming feeling of loss. But Lisa, in her barely there black dress, managed to stand out, drawing disapproving looks and whispers from everyone. Alex was just as detached, showing no sign of grief, almost as if he was relieved it was all over. The day after, I went to Mom's house, needing to feel her presence. But I was met with Lisa's sneering face. Looking for something, Hannah, she mocked, blocking the doorway. I need to get some of Mom's things, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I think you're mistaken. This is our house now. You have no business here, she replied, smirking. Alex came up behind her, a smug look on his face. Yeah, Hannah, Mom changed her will. Everything's ours now. Maybe you should have spent less time at the hospital and more time securing your inheritance. I was speechless, anger and disbelief swirling inside me. You can't be serious. Mom wouldn't do that, I managed to say, my voice cold. He shrugged, enjoying every moment of my distress. Believe what you want, but you're not welcome here, he said, while Lisa laughed, enjoying the spectacle. Guess you should have been nicer to us, huh? Their cruelty hit me hard, but I wasn't about to show them how much. We'll see what the notary says about this, I managed to say, my voice cold. Good luck with that, Alex called out as I walked away, their laughter echoing behind me. A week after the funeral, we all ended up in the notary's office, a place I never thought I'd be, fighting a family battle. The air was thick with tension. You could cut it with a knife. Alex and Lisa were smirking like they already won the lottery, but I had a card up my sleeve they didn't see coming. The notary cleared his throat, and the room went dead silent. The will Mr. Alex Kramer has been referring to, he began, I, my brother, is not the final will your mother made. Another visit here with Hannah to draft the final document. Lisa's face turned a shade I didn't know existed. What the hell does that mean? She spat, her voice like venom. It means, I said, my voice steady, that Mom knew better. She left the house to me, not you. The notary nodded. Indeed, the house goes to Hannah. Alex jumped up, his face red. She wouldn't do that. Lisa was on her feet too, screaming insults at me that would make a sailor blush. The notary raised his hand, calling for silence. There's more. If it's found that there was any pressure applied to change the will, legal actions could be taken. Alex, still fuming, shot back. I'm her son too. I deserve half of everything. The notary, unfazed, pulled out another document. Your mother anticipated such a claim. Hence, She divided her money into 2 equal parts. However, he paused, looking directly at Alex. She deducted from your share all the money you and your wife have received during your marriage. You could hear a pin drop. How much is left then? Alex's voice was barely a whisper. $10,000, the notary replied. Lissa's scream could probably be heard a mile away. 10,000? That's it? I couldn't help but feel a mix of sadness and relief. Mom had seen through their greed. Seems like Mom knew what she was doing, I said, more to myself than anyone else. Alex and Lisa were in shock, their dreams of easy money shattered in an instant. The notary suggested they leave before things got uglier. And they did, but not before throwing a few more choice words my way. After the showdown at the notary, things escalated pretty quickly. Alex and his wife, Lisa, were set on clinging to Mom's house like they owned the place. It was a mess, a proper circus show, until it got so heated that I had no choice but to call the cops. I never thought I'd see the day where I'd have to drag the police into family drama, but there we were. When they finally left under the watchful eyes of the police, the air in the house felt different, heavier somehow. Mark and I started the grim task of taking inventory, noting the gaps where things used to be. It was clear as day they'd been selling off Mom's things. My heart sank. How could they? I was livid, ready to drag them through the courts. I can't believe this, Mark. They've stolen from us from Mom. We should sue them for everything they've got left. Mark, ever the voice of reason, put a hand on my shoulder. Hannah, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but think about it. Maybe, just maybe, they'll use that money for something good, for the kid. His words hit me harder than I expected. It was a slim hope, clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally start acting like responsible adults for their child's sake. It didn't make what they did right, but it gave me a sliver of hope that maybe the cycle would break with their son. Deep down, I knew Mark was right. Pursuing them legally would just drag us all through more mud. And for what? The chance at a few dollars and more heartache? No, it was time to let go, to move forward, and focus on healing, on building something better from the wreckage they left behind. So I let it go, not for them, but for me, for us. It was time to close this chapter and start anew, with the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd find their way. Months rolled by in silence, a welcome break from the chaos that had enveloped our lives. But peace has a way of being fleeting. Word got to me that Alex and Lisa had sunk further, living in some rundown apartment, scraping by. Alex was jumping from one odd job to the next, and Lisa, she was chasing after rich men, leaving their little boy, my nephew, pretty much on his own. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. That kid deserved better, so much better than what those two could ever offer him. I started gathering the paperwork, the legal documents needed to strip them of their parental rights. It was a heavy decision, but every fiber of my being told me it was the right one. That boy needed a real family, stability, and I was determined to give it to him. When I finally approached Alex and Lisa with the idea, bracing for a fight, their reaction took me by surprise. They were indifferent, almost relieved to be rid of the responsibility. "You sure about this, Hannah?" Alex asked, no hint of the brother I once knew in his eyes. You know, taking on a kid is a lot. I couldn't hide my disgust, my disappointment. "He's your son, Alex. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Lisa, ever the opportunist, chimed in with a shrug. "If you think you can give him a better life, then why not? We've got our own lives to figure out." Their casual dismissal of their flesh and blood boiled my blood, but I swallowed the anger. This was about him, not them. "Yeah, I'm sure, more than you've ever been about anything. He'll be loved and cared for. That's more than what you've ever offered him." The paperwork was straightforward, their signatures quick and emotionless. As I walked away, documents in hand, it was a bittersweet victory. That little boy was going to have a chance now, a real family with me and Mark. It's been a stretch of quiet months, a silence from Alex and Lisa that spoke volumes. They vanished off the grid, no calls answered, no trace of them at their last known spot. I've toyed with the idea of getting the authorities involved. wondering if a missing poster is the next step. Meanwhile, our home's been filled with a different kind of noise, the joyful chaos of kids and their boundless energy. Our little nephew, now effectively my third child, has settled in as if he's always been here. My kids, bless them, have taken to him like ducks to water, showering him with the kind of love and attention that's both heartwarming and a tad overwhelming. "We're going to build the biggest fort this living room has ever seen," declares my eldest, rallying the troops with a sparkle in her eyes that could outshine the sun. The little one, barely understanding but eager all the same, claps his hands with glee, a toothy grin plastered across his face. "Fort, fort," he echoes, stumbling over the words but clear in his enthusiasm. Mark and we've moved into my old house, a sprawling place that seemed too vast once but now feels just right. There's a room for every mood, a space for every laughter, and a corner for every whispered secret. It's become a home in the truest sense, filled with memories we're making fresh each day. "I never thought we'd fill this place up," I muse aloud one evening, watching the kids turn the living room into a labyrinth of cushions and blankets. Mark wraps an arm around me, pulling me close. We always had the space, just needed the right people to fill it. And he's right. This house, once echoing with the past, now thrums with the present and whispers promises of the future. As for Alex and Lisa, their absence is a void, but not one that sucks the life out of us. If anything, it's given us clarity, a purpose. We've built something solid, something real, out of the wreckage they left behind. We've turned a page, started a new chapter, and in this story, we're all exactly where we're meant to be. I've been going through a rough time with my family. I turned 18 last week, and my dad thought it was the right time to kick me out. My mother passed away when I was 3 years old in an unfortunate accident. Since then, my dad has had a long list of girlfriends and failed relationships. Even as a kid, I'd never seen him without a woman in the house. I had a nanny to look after me during the day while my dad was at work, and whenever he would come back, his girlfriend at the time would be with him. He cut ties with my mother's family after her passing because he didn't see the point of keeping in touch with them. I assumed they didn't want a reminder of the tragedy, so they didn't claim custody to be able to visit me either. Growing up, it was just me and my dad, but he never seemed very interested in being a father to me. He mostly spent his time either working or hanging out with his girlfriend, whoever it happened to be at the time. I tried really hard to get along with him as a kid, but I never received any love and affection from him. He just did the bare minimum for me, so I gradually learned to expect nothing at all. That was my childhood, lonely and kind of sad, but thankfully, I still had my grandfather to keep me company. Unfortunately, he couldn't take me in because my father didn't want to give up custody. Sometimes he'd visit me, and at other times I'd go to him. But my father made sure very carefully that I didn't end up spending more than maybe 3 or 4 days at his place. My visits to my grandfather were regulated by my dad, and I still don't know why he was so finicky about it. I don't know why my father wasn't willing to give up custody, even though he treated me coldly. As I got older, I began to rebel because I wanted to spend more time at my grandfather's place. Obviously, it was because my grandfather showed me more love and affection and actually seemed to care about me beyond just the basics. But my father wasn't willing to let me, and even when I brought up how my grandfather treated me infinitely better than he did, my father would still say that at the end of the day he's my dad and whatever he says goes. My grandfather tried to get my dad to treat me like his own kid several times, but nothing ever changed, nor did he let me move out and live with my grandpa. So even in my teens, I had to continue living with my father. That was pretty much the worst phase of our relationship, and things only got worse after he met my current stepmother, Veronica. Veronica used to be our neighbor's niece who'd been living with our neighbor until her company was able to provide her with proper accommodation. But then she and my dad started going out, and they got married about a year ago after almost 8 months of dating. My dad seemed to dislike having me around, but never did anything about it until Veronica came around, and then the both of them turned pretty vicious towards me, Veronica had it in for me ever since the first day, and I had no idea why. It's not like I'd done anything to her, and in fact, I'd always tried to be very nice to her. But she hated my guts. I guess it had something to do with the fact that I was my dad's son from his previous marriage, and she couldn't stand the fact that I was still around because that was just a reminder that my dad had been married before or something. But that's just my theory of why she hated me so much. Maybe she just didn't need a reason to hate me, and that's the kind of person that she was. I don't know. The bottom line was that she hated me, period, and my life got a lot worse after she started dating my father. She'd make it a point to be as horrible to me as she possibly could whenever we were in the same room. She practically treated me like a housekeeper or something and would make me do all the chores, even though we had a maid, and my dad never said a word against it. I felt like Cinderella in my own house. Once she moved in, she not only made my dad stop giving me money for going out with my friends, but she also convinced him that I was old enough to get a part-time job and make my own money. So I had to get a job after that, which was a much easier alternative than begging my dad to treat me like a human being. It was horrible because Veronica seemed bent on making my life a nightmare at my father's house, and I couldn't wait for the day that I could finally go away to college and move out of this place. I did tell my grandfather about the way I was being treated after Veronica moved in, and he told me that he'd talk to my father about it and do something. But things never changed, and after a while, I just gave up hope that maybe my grandfather would be able to make things better for me. I would vent to him, and he'd listen to me patiently, but that's all that happened, and things never changed. After a while, I just accepted that I had to deal with my dad and Veronica until I was able to afford to move out of this place. Then, about a week ago on my birthday, I was planning on going out with my friends and celebrating my 18th by buying a couple of beers and having a fun night. I'd been saving up money for a while so I could splurge. But then my dad and Veronica decided that they had terrible news to give me, just so they could ruin my birthday. On the morning of my birthday, they told me that I needed to leave the house and find another place to stay. They told me that they were evicting me since Veronica had found out a couple of weeks ago that she was pregnant, and they wanted to use my room as a nursery for the new baby. My dad told me that they had come to this conclusion after a lot of thought, and they would rather that I did not beg or act all prophetic, so they'd reconsider because that would just ruin their happy mojo. Veronica told me that since I was an adult now, I needed to look out for myself, and this could be the start of something great. She tried her best to sound concerned and hopeful, but all I heard was a conniving snake trying to get me kicked out of my house. I tried to tone down the panic that I was feeling and decided to be rational with them, because I knew that crying, kicking, and screaming weren't going to get me anywhere with these people. They had no sympathy for me, so I told them that legally they couldn't evict me without notice, and that they needed to wait for a couple of months until I was able to find a place for myself. I honestly had no idea what I was talking about, but I'm pretty sure that a law like that exists. My dad didn't fall for it though and told me that he had everything worked out with his lawyer already, and he highly doubted that I had enough money or resources to come after them legally anyway, which he was right about. I didn't have either of those. So I suggested that I could pay rent for as long as I would live with them. And Veronica shot that down instantly by telling me that rent was not the problem, and that she just didn't want unnecessary people to deal with when she was pregnant. So I needed to vacate the house anyway, just so she could have a peaceful pregnancy. I was grasping for straws, but I still made a last attempt and asked my dad if it would be okay if I moved to the basement or something because I was pretty desperate. And my dad still said no. He worked in a bank and made a decent income, so much so that Veronica had actually quit her job to be a stay-at-home wife, so I knew that money was not the problem. After some bickering, I realized I couldn't change their minds and they wanted me out at any cost. Now that I was an adult, they could kick me out without any legal repercussions, and I couldn't even do anything about it. So, I accepted defeat and went up to my room to pack my things and leave. I had no idea if my grandfather would be able to take me in or not. One of the major reasons that I hadn't moved in with him against my dad's orders was because he wasn't very financially stable. He'd been a high school science teacher, but was now retired. He had an unfortunate gambling addiction when my dad was in his 20s, which really messed up his savings, and he relied on my father heavily. He could barely even support himself. So, I had no idea how he'd be able to support me as well, and that's why I hadn't moved in with him earlier. But now I had no other choice. To be fair, it wasn't like my grandfather was starving or something. He lived modestly, and I could get used to it. But I didn't want to push him into a corner. Without thinking much, I headed over to my grandfather's place. Once I was there, I told him what my father had said. For about a year now, I'd been trying not to worry about this, but somewhere deep down, I'd known that this day would come. I also had to worry about how I would pay for college because I was supposed to start in the fall, and that was just a couple of months away. Thinking about all of that just made me overwhelmed, and so I started crying. That's when my grandfather told me that he'd had enough and he'd seen enough. So it was time to do what he should have done several years ago. I didn't understand what was going on, and neither did he tell me. But he went into another room to make a phone call. I tried to eavesdrop, but I could barely hear anything, so I gave up trying. After almost an hour and a half, my grandfather finally came out of that room and told me that I had nothing to worry about anymore. I could live with him now, and I wouldn't have to worry about college either. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he told me that it was none of my business right now, and he sounded really upset. So I didn't push it further. Then he told me to go enjoy my day with my friends like I planned to because my 18th birthday was not a day for me to sit at home and mope. Besides, now that things were all right, I had nothing to worry about, so I could go out and enjoy myself. After deciding to make the most of my day now that my problems seemed to be solved, I went out with my friends. I kept my phone on silent for the evening in case my dad called and had something to say. I didn't want to let him ruin my evening like he'd ruined the rest of my day. I didn't find out about his texts and calls until I got back to my grandfather's place, which wasn't until almost 10 in the night. I don't know what got into him, but it appeared to me that he had suddenly developed a conscience somehow and was begging me to come back. I didn't reply to him immediately but waited until the next morning to say that I won't be coming back. I didn't hold back and told him the reason that I wasn't coming back was because he'd never treated me well. And now that I finally had a chance to be happy, I wasn't going to give that up. Also, because Veronica was even worse than him, and I couldn't bear the thought of going back to living with him again. He controlled me for a long time, but now that I was an adult, I could choose where I wanted to live, and he had no right to tell me to come back, especially not after how he and his wife had kicked me out just the day before. After I sent those texts, I received one long text back from my father, and it was a pretty sad one too. He told me that he thought about things in private and came across an old photo album of me in his office, which just reminded him of all the promises that he'd made to my mother. It felt like he was letting her down right now by putting Veronica and the new baby over me. So he wanted me to give him one last chance and actually be a better father this time around because the news of the new pregnancy had just spooked him a little bit, which is why he'd done whatever Veronica asked of him without a second thought. But now he realized that he shouldn't have kicked me out and wanted me to come back desperately. I didn't reply to that text because I knew that he was trying to manipulate me. But I just didn't understand what he was going to gain from this, and I still don't get it. It's been a week, and he's been texting me every day, constantly reminding me of a couple of good times from my childhood and telling me how sorry he is for how he treated me. Initially, I thought that he was trying to manipulate me, but now I just don't know anymore. I tried to talk to my grandfather about it, but he just told me not to fall for his act and seemed very put off by his son's behavior. I feel kind of sorry for my dad because now he's finally trying to be nice to me, but I don't want to go back anymore, and I feel like a jerk for some reason. The rational part of my brain knows that this is what's right for me, but a part of me just wants to go back and see what can be and if my dad will actually change or not. I don't know why, but he's trying to be a good father and make me come back even though he knows Veronica won't like it. But he's willing to put up with her outburst too just to get me back, and I feel like I owe him a second chance. Yesterday, he texted me and said that he was willing to even beg on his knees for me to come back if that's what it was going to take. And I felt sorry, but I still didn't feel sure enough to reply. And it's making me feel guilty for not wanting to go back to my father's house even though he's begging me to return. Update 1. So, I've made up my mind. I'm not going back to my dad's house, and I don't think he meant any of what he said. I just discovered that the reason my dad's been begging me to come back has nothing to do with me but more to do with his lifestyle and maintaining it, if you catch my drift. I sat my grandfather down and told him all about how my dad was begging me to come back, and I still didn't want to go, and it was just making me feel like a horrible human being, and I was feeling very guilty about it. I tried to talk to him about this before, but he just told me not to fall for it and left it at that. This time, I felt like I needed to get all of this out of my system, even if he wasn't any help. After hearing me out, my grandfather got really serious and told me that he wasn't allowed to talk to me about this, but he felt like it was finally time that I knew. He then told me that ever since I was a kid, my dad didn't have to pay for anything to do with me, and that it was all my mother's family contributing and funding my upbringing. Now that I've been kicked out of my father's house, my grandfather had spoken to my mom's family and told them about how I was being treated, which is why they decided that I must now live with my grandfather. They were pretty pissed off at him as well for allowing this to go on for so many years and never saying a word about it. But now they insisted that I live with my grandfather. My dad didn't know about any of this and found out only a couple of days ago after he kicked me out. And my grandfather told him about this. My grandfather was the bridge between my mother's family and my dad and had been passing the money to him, which my mother's family would send. My dad always assumed that it was my grandfather funding everything, and my grandfather never corrected him because he knew that my dad didn't like my mother's side and wouldn't take money from them, which would, in turn, affect me because my dad was never willing to spend money on me. So he kept it a secret and pretended like he was giving my dad money to bring me up. My mother's family was pretty rich, so it was like huge amounts of money, which is probably why I went to a private school for so long, because my dad would never have wanted to spend money like that on me. Unfortunately, after my dad married Veronica, he started keeping those funds from me and forced me to get a job just so I could afford even basic things like going out once in a while and buying clothes and shoes that I desperately needed because I'd outgrown the previous ones. I mean, I know it's not exactly like he was depriving me of food or anything, but it still felt pretty bad. My grandfather still didn't tell my mother's side anything because he was afraid of the consequences and didn't know what they would have to say about this, so he just kept it all quiet. But once I got kicked out, he realized that he had to speak up for my sake and finally told them the truth. I was mad at my grandfather for never telling me about any of this, but then he told me that he had no option but my mother's family wanted this to be a secret. Apparently, they didn't want me to know that they were the ones paying for everything because then I'd probably want to meet them. And they didn't want to meet me, not because they didn't like me, but only because they said that I looked too much like my mother and they couldn't bring themselves to do it. So it was more of an emotional reason than a practical one that stopped my grandfather from telling me anything. I was a little mad at him for never stepping up and telling them how my father and Veronica were treating me as well. But he said that he was afraid that if he spoke up about it, my mother's family would intervene and have me taken away from them, and then he'd never get to see me again. It was an irrational fear, but he was still afraid of it. We talked things out, and I have to admit, I'm still trying to process a lot of it, but at least I know the truth now. And I'm definitely not going to fall for my dad's manipulation because he's only trying to get me back so my mother's family will continue sending him the money, and he can use it for his benefit. I knew that his new avatar was too good to be true anyway, so I'm not too upset about any of this. Update 2. So, after learning the truth about why my father was so desperate to get me back, I blocked him. It's been a couple of days since then, and since he can't contact me, he started using Veronica's number to text me. Even she called me to let me know that I was being horrible to my father. I didn't have her number saved, so I accidentally answered the call. As soon as I heard her voice on the other end, I wanted to hang up, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stayed. She pretended like she was crying and told me through mock sobs that my dad was really upset and she couldn't see him like this, especially in her condition, as if she had a disease or something. I told her that I wasn't interested in speaking to her, and she handed over the phone to my dad, who was about to say something. But I cut him off and said that he could drop his little act now because I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to fall for it. He said that he didn't know what I was talking about, so I told him that maybe my mother's family could explain better, and then hung up and blocked Veronica's number as well. It was pretty satisfying to hand it back to them, and my grandfather thinks that I dealt with it well. In other news, I spoke to my grandfather, and I told him that I really wanted to meet my mother's family, even though I knew that they didn't want me to meet them because it was hard for them to see me. But I just had to see these people and thank them for everything that they did for me. It was a little difficult, but my grandfather finally managed to convince them to fly down here and meet me for the first time. I have seen pictures of my mother's family, her parents, and her older brother, but I guess meeting them is going to be very, very different. I don't know what to expect, and there's still a couple of days to go before I have to see them. But I'm excited, and I know that no matter what, they're going to love me. And even though this is my first time ever seeing them in person, I know that I'll love them too. Update 3. Hey, I'm back from my first meeting with my mother's family, and I'm happy to say that it went well. My grandfather was there with me every step of the way, and I'm glad for it because I was pretty nervous. My other grandparents were also lovely people, and my uncle was actually just the same person as I am, but just a lot older. All of us cried a little when we saw each other, which was pretty awkward for the other guests at the restaurant to see. But we didn't care. We were just so happy to meet each other. Once we got over the emotional part of the meeting, they started asking me about my life and interests, and I told them everything. They actually seemed to be interested and cared about me. They also told me that I didn't need to worry about my college funds because they had it all planned out but had forgotten to mention it to my grandfather. That was a huge relief as well. We had a great time overall, and we're going to meet a couple more times before they fly back home next week. They promised me that we're going to meet every month, and they'll either have me fly out to them or they'll come to me. But we definitely will catch up every month, and I'm really happy about it. My sister and I have always had a distant relationship, primarily due to the significant age gap between us. Our parents, too, treated us differently from the very beginning. Before my sister was born, our family faced a challenging period when my dad lost his job. Forced to rent out our house and move into a smaller place, we had to make numerous adjustments with limited resources. Despite my dad's efforts to find employment, it became increasingly difficult. Both my parents started submitting job applications, and eventually, my mom received a call from an old contact offering a position in a new venture. The pay wasn't substantial, but it was an improvement from our previous situation. 6 months later, my dad was finally hired, and while we were doing better, we still had debts to settle. 3 months after losing his job, we had moved and rented out our house. Realizing that it would take time for things to return to normal, we continued renting. A year later, my mom was pregnant, prompting us to move into a slightly larger apartment. Despite the improved circumstances, my parents remained cautious with money. Throughout this time, my communication with my parents dwindled to brief greetings and goodbyes. Their preoccupation with financial worries dominated our conversations. When we first shifted, I used to eagerly await their return, but both were exhausted and barely acknowledged me. Despite my efforts to be independent and help out, they seemed oblivious. After our second move, all attention shifted to my pregnant mom. I tried to express my feelings, but she was easily irritated and dismissed my attempts at conversation. My dad, working long hours, would arrive home later than my mom, often ignoring me. I felt like a stranger in my own home, crying myself to sleep while they remained indifferent. 3 months after my dad lost his job, I was transferred to a public school, never returning to my previous one. The loneliness at home and the lack of friends at the new school intensified my desire to reconnect with my old life. As my mom's pregnancy progressed, they seemed to forget my existence entirely. I felt sad and hurt, unable to address the situation. In the final trimester of my mom's pregnancy, with the impending birth just days away, I found myself alone at home while she was at the hospital. Despite my solitude, I refrained from complaining, only wishing for her well-being and the chance to meet the new addition to our family. Upon their return, the baby took center stage, leaving me feeling ignored and isolated. When I asked to see the baby, my mom became agitated, instructing me to leave, and my dad remained silent. I never had the chance to spend quality time with my sister or hold her. My mom was extremely protective, and although my dad attempted a few times to let me be near her, my mom always intervened. It felt as though she harbored a deep resentment towards me, and I couldn't fathom why. A few months after my mom's recovery, my parents decided to move back into the house we owned. I held on to a glimmer of hope that returning home would bring about a return to normalcy. However, as time passed, their attitude towards me worsened. One day, I had a breakdown in front of them, waking up my sister in the process. This led to anger from all of them, and I found myself locked in my room, crying myself to sleep. I soon realized that even though we now own a house, it wasn't spacious. With only 2 bedrooms, they placed me in the attic to make room for my sister. Cleaning the attic was my responsibility, and it was a horrible, cold, and dark place. Without any wiring, there was no possibility of light. I often went up there when my parents had gone to bed, only to sneak back down and sleep on the couch. They caught me a few times but didn't seem to care, as long as I stayed out of their way. As I grew older, I got a job that they were unaware of. When I received my first paycheck, I initially wanted to buy them something in the hopes of gaining their approval. However, I talked myself out of it, collecting the money without spending it on myself either. Eventually, it was time for university, and although I had little money, it wasn't enough to cover the fees, food, and living costs. When I brought up the idea of university, they outright declined, claiming they didn't have much. Their focus remained on my sister, and I didn't hold it against her. We never talked much growing up, and any attempt to bond would result in unnecessary drama. It seemed better for both of us to keep our distance. Despite the challenges, my only chance of going to university was securing a full scholarship. I applied for numerous scholarships using a neighbor's laptop, and fortunately, I managed to get into a good university. I couldn't secure a full scholarship, forcing me to cover my own living and food expenses for university, which was located 2 states away. Determined to make it work, I reached out to the kind cafe owner for a job. She was an older lady, sweet and experienced, having been at the cafe for quite some time. Upon moving, I realized my parents were indifferent to my absence. They wouldn't even notice if I hadn't informed them. The challenge of finding affordable housing seemed daunting given the high costs and required down payments. Seeking refuge, I approached the cafe owner, explaining my situation. She empathized with my predicament and offered a room upstairs, deducting the cost from my paycheck. Grateful for a roof over my head, I took on additional jobs in my free time. The cafe owner, expressing genuine concern for me, surprised me with her kindness. Slowly, I settled into my new life, successfully navigating university and securing a position through pre-placements. With the prospect of a stable job, I purchased expensive clothes for the first time, realizing my worn-out hoodie wouldn't suit the professional image I needed. The first person I shared my success with was the cafe owner, who had been a pillar of support when I needed it the most. She rejoiced with me, hugging and kissing me while expressing pride in my accomplishments. I felt a deep connection with her. She had become like family, and I genuinely loved her. After graduating, I needed to find a place closer to my job, and the cafe owner accompanied me to help make the decision. Even after settling in, I maintained a close relationship with her, visiting once or twice a month and keeping regular contact. Despite my efforts, my attempts to reach out to my parents were met with silence. They never answered my calls, and when my sister occasionally picked up, the conversations felt awkward. During my time at work, I made friends who, despite my introverted nature, made an effort to include me. They invited me to outings, and though I usually declined, their persistence occasionally convinced me to join in. As my life continued to unfold, about a year later, the company generously distributed free tickets for a mini vacation. Though I had never used my vacation days before, I decided to seize the opportunity and bring along the only family I knew, the kind cafe owner I affectionately called Auntie. She wasn't old enough to be a grandma, and I insisted on her being my travel companion. My friends at the company were intrigued and excited to meet Auntie. Interestingly, she turned out to be an extrovert and quickly became friends with my colleagues. During the trip, a guy approached me and Auntie, in her exuberance, encouraged me to spend time with him. To my surprise, that encounter led to a deeper connection, and he eventually became my husband. He lived conveniently close to where I worked. Upon returning from the vacation, my now husband called me and asked me out. We dated for 2 months, were in a relationship for 3 years, and have now been happily married for 4 years. Despite the joyous occasion, my past with my family loomed in the background. When I invited my parents and sister to my wedding, they were no-shows. My then-fiancé was aware of the situation and was understandably upset, even contemplating not inviting them. A year or two later, my sister got married, and I was not on the guest list. I saw pictures online and congratulated her, understanding that her lavish wedding was likely funded by our parents. It didn't bother me. I had moved on and found happiness in my life. During this time, I was pregnant with our first child, and my husband, along with his supportive parents, became my new family. Auntie also visited frequently, and sometimes our home hosted a gathering of all our loved ones during my pregnancy. One day, my aunt received a letter in my name, and I was surprised to find out it was from my parents. I thought they might have heard about my pregnancy and wanted to reach out. I had informed them of my university address years ago, and my contact information had changed since then. At 5 months pregnant, I spoke to my husband about it, and he was understandably hesitant, given the sudden reappearance of my estranged parents after years of silence. My husband, concerned about potential inappropriate content in the letter, asked if he could read it first. He was always careful around me, especially since I was pregnant. When my aunt brought the letter 2 to 3 days later, my husband's expression turned to disgust as he read its contents. He chose not to share the details with me, advising against reading it and simply comforting me with hugs and empathy. Eventually, I decided to face the reality and asked my aunt to read the letter aloud. To my dismay, my parents had lost their house, which was apparently mortgaged for my sister's extravagant wedding with her now divorced husband. My parents had invested their money in it too. Now they were asking me to pay back the money they claimed I owed them for the years they took care of me. My sister's ex-husband refused to pay the mortgage, and she couldn't afford it either. Sitting there with a blank face, my husband's comforting arms around me, I felt pure disappointment. That night, I went to sleep crying, feeling guilty for letting my baby be affected by my selfish parents. However, I decided not to let them disrupt my happiness. I sought legal advice, and my lawyer sent them a warning about potential harassment charges if they continued to contact me. Another letter addressed child neglect, emphasizing that I owed them nothing, from the clothes I wore to the food I ate to the house I owned. I made it clear that my success, marriage, and the life I had built were a result of my and my husband's hard work and efforts. Before all this unfolded, I worked diligently to put myself through school and college. I secured a job and earned promotions through my hard work and dedication. Throughout these milestones, my parents were absent. They neither supported nor contributed financially. The meager scraps I turned into sandwiches, and the leftovers I barely ate from their table, did not constitute genuine care or support. In response to their claim that I owed them for the years they supposedly took care of me, I asserted that they had contacted the wrong child. The true architect of their financial predicament was their dear daughter, who had mortgaged the house they had put in her name. I made it clear that they had dug their own hole and should climb out of it by themselves. An update, 2 months later, brings me close to my delivery date. As far as I know, my parents have not attempted to contact me again. My sister, it seems, gave the house to the bank, and I'm unsure if they owe any more debts. They appear to be back to where they started, and with this update, I consider this chapter of my life concluded. I'd rather prioritize spending quality time with you over concerning myself with status or honor, spoke the woman to me. She happened to be the second daughter of the CEO of the company where I am employed, but more importantly, she was my beloved wife. Sadly, she departed from this world prematurely, leaving behind no parting words. 2 years had elapsed since her passing when a woman approached me, claiming to be my wife's sister. My name is Tyler Brown, 34 years old, I introduced myself. Raised solely by my mother due to my absent father, I never perceived my family dynamics as complicated, despite their divorce being attributed to trivial disputes. My mother always praised my forward-looking and earnest nature, which I cherished dearly. However, tragedy struck when she unexpectedly passed away during my high school years. Taken in by my grandparents, I adopted my mother's advice to confront life with determination. At 27, I married an extraordinary woman named Mary Johnson, who encouraged me to give my best every day. Mary, employed in HR, and I, working in the planning department of the same company, embarked on our daily routine together. Despite being the CEO's younger daughter, Mary chose to conceal her identity at work, preferring to be recognized for her merit rather than her lineage. Her decision both surprised and impressed me, deepening my love for her. Following a nervous courtship of 2 years, we tied the knot. Meeting Mary's family, particularly her father, filled me with apprehension. However, his warm laughter eased my nerves as he assured me that my worth and compatibility with Mary were evident, irrespective of the company's hierarchy. He even jestingly mentioned his elder daughter, Nancy, as a potential successor, emphasizing that she would bring home a worthy partner someday. Beside him, Nancy exuded a demure demeanor, contrasting with Mary's vibrant personality. Confirming her father's words, Mary remarked, "You know, unlike me, my sister has always been smart. It seems she wants to get married soon, but either her standards are too high or she's too beautiful that nobody dares to approach her." At that moment, I was overwhelmed with happiness for having received permission to marry. The married life that began with Mary was pure bliss. Motivated at work, people around me half-jokingly said, "You could become the next CEO, I guess." But the idea seemed daunting. Mary herself commented, "Sure, any woman might dream of being a CEO's wife, but that must be so busy. I'd rather have more time with Tyler than money or status." Her sentiment filled me with joy. Indeed, she preferred visiting her favorite Cosmos fields over fancy restaurants whenever we had the time. I thought we have a leisurely life ahead, perhaps with children. Less than a year into our marriage, Mary collapsed and was rushed to the hospital for examination. The diagnosis left me numb, while her father was deeply shocked. Mary tried to stay positive, saying, "It's okay. Maybe it'll clear up sooner than we think," with a laugh. But in private, she broke down. "If anything happens to me, Tyler, please keep looking forward and live," she said, tearfully. "I can't help crying when I see your face. I'll write you a letter." However, she left this world too quickly to write anything. When I rushed from work to the hospital, only the sobs of her father and sister Nancy could be heard in her room. The funeral proceeded mechanically, and the CEO told me to take some time off work, saying, "There's no need to force yourself to continue." That night, alone at home, I cried until dawn, holding a photo of Mary laughing amidst the Cosmos fields. As the sun rose, I remembered her words and my mother's, realizing I had to face forward. I called the CEO immediately. "I'd like to return to work tomorrow if possible," I said. From the next day onwards, I threw myself into work, consumed by it. After work, I'd rush home to talk about recent events in front of Mary's photo and clean up her room, ensuring I never forgot about her. Of course, I felt lonely, but I had resolved to live on my own. After a few years passed, the CEO called me in, and we met in a formal private dining room. "Do you have any interest in taking over the company? Even setting aside Mary's situation, your efforts and capabilities are such that I believe I can entrust it to you," he said, looking me straight in the eye. I had only worked hard these past 2 years with the intention of repaying him for bringing Mary into my life. The thought of becoming the next president myself was bewildering. To encourage me, he continued, "Mary was looking forward to you becoming the next CEO as well." She never mentioned such a thing to me, but maybe she was just trying to be considerate, thinking it's better not to become the CEO, I replied. "No, I heard it from Nancy," he said, mentioning his elder daughter's name as if on cue. The door to the private room opened, and Nancy entered. "Good evening. It's been a while." She greeted me with her usual long hair and dignified voice, sitting next to the CEO. Then he approached the real topic of discussion. "Of course, we've considered your abilities and believe you can take on the role of the next CEO. After much thought, would you marry Nancy?" Excuse me. I wanted to believe it was some joke, but there was no hint of jest in either of their expressions. However, no matter the excuses, the conclusion wouldn't change. "I'm sorry, but I must decline." "There's the matter of Mary," I said firmly. "I understand how you feel, but what if it was her request?" Nancy began to reveal something she hadn't had much chance to talk about. After Mary's hospitalization, she had made frequent visits to her, as if to make up for lost time. During their alone time, Mary often mentioned looking forward to me becoming the CEO. Furthermore, it was right before Mary passed away that she held my hand and asked me to please look after Tyler if something happens. I don't think she meant marriage by that, but embarrassingly, I haven't had much luck myself, Nancy admitted. But I want to consider my father's situation. "Of course, it would be a marriage in name only, if you prefer," she said. Hearing about Mary's wishes I was unaware of left me with a complicated feeling. I was facing their desperate pleas and Mary's will, which moved me drastically. Then I said, "I understand," amidst my mixed thoughts. Those were the words that came out, thinking it would be for Mary's sake. The conversation progressed smoothly from there, and Nancy was to come live at my place. It was to be a marriage in name only, though she was working at a company known to her father, and we agreed not to interfere with each other's lives. Even though it was Mary's sister, the idea of living with another woman in a house filled with memories of Mary was something I had reservations about. Would it be all right if I paid my respects to Mary right away? On her first visit to my house, seeing Nancy close her eyes and pray in front of Mary's photo somehow made me feel more accepting. "I know I can't compare to her, but if there's anything I can support you with, please let me know," Nancy said as she started to unpack her things. "It might still be a long way off before I actually become the CEO, but if that time comes, perhaps I would need someone's support," I admitted. I was still in doubt if it was really okay with Nancy. But before I knew it, as she struggled to carry a cardboard box with her slender arms, I naturally offered, "I can help with that." Surprised by my voice, she lost her grip and dropped the box. "I'm sorry," she apologized repeatedly. Seeing her, I said, "If there's anything I can do to help, please let me support you," as I started picking up scattered albums and other items. No, I can take care of myself." She hurriedly gathered the scattered items. Honestly, her actions made me curious. In a way, she possibly wasn't entirely happy about marrying me, even if it was for her father or sister's sake. Still, I decided to maintain some distance and said, "Then I'll go to the city hall. Feel free to use anything in the house." Holding the already completed marriage registration form for Nancy and me, I left the room. As I drove to the city hall, my mind was swirling with all sorts of thoughts. I needed to hurry before the office closed, but somehow my mind was adrift. and I found myself driving leisurely. The smile that Nancy had given me when she said, "Take care," kept coming back to me because it reminded me so much of Mary. Moreover, there were several sheets of stationery that I saw among Nancy's belongings. On the sheets, there was one adorned with Mary's favorite flowers, cosmos, the same ones I happened upon in front of me. There was a park near the city hall that was filled with beautiful swaying cosmos. I couldn't help but stop the car and just stand there, lost in thought. Mary would have been delighted to see this. I wish we could have seen it together, I pondered, losing track of time. Eventually, I snapped back to reality, finished my errands, and went home. "I'm sorry, but I need to rest a bit," I said to Nancy, who was still busy with her tasks. And then I retreated to my bed in my room alone. My thoughts wandered to Mary and her family. I remembered their comments, like Mary was looking forward to you becoming the CEO, or it was right before Mary passed away. She held my hand and said, "Please take care of Tyler if anything happens." I had always thought Mary was sincere and always spoke her mind. Was she even just being considerate of me? Or could it be? As if to interrupt these troubling thoughts, I fell into a deep sleep, perhaps due to the recent day's business. When I woke up, the day had already changed, and the house was silent. I hadn't prepared anything for the next day's work, and more importantly, I had left Nancy alone for too long. I hadn't even told her where she could sleep. Deciding to at least get a glass of water, I left my bedroom. That's when I saw Nancy's figure illuminated by the moonlight in front of Mary's photo. Perhaps she decided to stay in the living room with her belongings. Not wanting to wake me, she must have had so much she wanted to talk to Mary about. When I was about to apologize by feeling guilty about my earlier thoughts, I heard her whisper, "Thank you, Mary." I stopped in my tracks, not wanting to intrude on the moment between sisters. That was just it. It seemed like Nancy was smiling in the moonlight, and there was the stationery paper adorned with cosmos in her hands. Before I could connect all the dots, I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it really be? It didn't take long for my suspicions to turn into certainty. Now everything will bow to me. At that moment, my fear turned into anger. "What do you mean by that, Nancy? You're awake," she exclaimed, startled by the light I turned on. In her voice, she turned towards me, visibly shaken, and began to ramble like a child caught in a lie. I thought I'd sleep by Mary's side tonight, but I didn't respond, fixated on one thing she noticed and tried to hide. But I picked it up before she could. That was the stationery paper with Cosmos printed on it, addressed to Tyler, in familiar handwriting. "This is Mary's handwriting, isn't it? Why do you have this?" I demanded. "Oh no, she stammered, struggling for an excuse. I decided to open the letter rather than wait for her answer. Trembling, I pulled out several letters from inside. Letters in Mary's handwriting, filled with memories of us and apologies for leaving ahead. Mary had indeed left me letters as promised in her hospital room. A mix of emotions threatened to overwhelm me. As one sentence caught my eye, my anger reignited. "I hate to say this about family, but be careful of my sister. She's always been a bit crafty," I said, looking back at Nancy. Her furrowed brows seemed to be searching for her next move, and there was a cunning, calculating expression on her face. It seemed she might have been the first to discover and read Mary's letters, hiding them to twist Mary's last wishes to her advantage, exploiting the fact that Mary was no longer here to speak for herself. "You just wanted to be the CEO's wife, didn't you?" I questioned Nancy, putting the letters back into the envelope neatly and slipping them into my left pocket, determined not to let Mary be tarnished by her any longer. Then, as if conceding everything, the woman in front of me sighed, then defiantly began to speak. "That's right. But think about it. Don't you think I'm far more suitable to be the CEO's wife than some woman who has no abilities other than flattering people? But no one was interested in you, right?" She seemed taken aback by my words for a moment, but quickly smirked and said, "Yes, but I'll settle for you. Besides, the marriage certificate has already been filed." With that, she arrogantly leaned back. As she spoke, I pulled a crumpled envelope from my right pocket and dropped the marriage certificate it contained onto the floor. She hastily picked it up, looking up at me with a gaze that was almost insane. I couldn't help but be curious, so I went directly to ask your father about your past instead of going to the city hall. You've been flaunting around as the CEO's daughter, constantly searching for a capable man, haven't you? He said you were looking for someone suitable for the next CEO, but in reality, you were just looking for someone to marry for status and honor. I wasn't sure why I became so fixated on Nancy at that moment. Perhaps it was the cosmos field that suddenly appeared in front of my car on my way to the city hall that made me stop, looking back. Maybe Mary was the one who stopped me. Please, just leave now. Never distort Mary's feelings again, I managed to say, holding back my anger. Then Nancy clenched her teeth and hissed, "Why? Why doesn't anything go my way?" She stormed out of the house, taking only her smartphone and wallet. She must have been cornered, unable to make calm decisions. But that's no excuse to disrespect my beloved Mary, even if they were sisters. I searched through the cardboard boxes left in the living room and, as expected, found another piece of stationery paper with Cosmos on it. Holding the letter addressed to Dad, I hurried to the CEO's place, despite the late hour. Nancy did such a thing, reading the hidden letters from Mary. The CEO showed a complex expression, just like mine earlier. He didn't go through the contents in detail, but shared a specific part with me in Mary's handwriting. It said, "Tyler is hardworking and dedicated, but he tends to take on too much by himself. So, Dad, please don't push him to be a successor unnecessarily." Mary never wanted me to become the CEO. She loved me for who I am, not for the title. On the contrary, how nasty that woman was. "Tyler, I'm truly sorry. Nancy has always been secretive, unlike Mary, but to think she would deceive even me." The CEO apologized repeatedly. I was at a loss about what to do next. However, gently returning the letters to the envelope, he looked at me directly and said, "I won't interfere in your life anymore. But if you're willing, would you consider being part of the family as my son-in-law has my beloved Mary's husband?" His words saved me, and even years later, I am still working under him. He treats me as his son-in-law and potential successor, sometimes sternly but always with love. Under one condition, I decided to take over as CEO, never to let Nancy claim to be part of Mary's family again. The CEO had intended to disown her even before I said anything, and indeed, he has cut off all contact with her since then. Moreover, he is considering taking legal action against her for destroying private documents under criminal law. As for her, she has lost her job, her family, and the title she so depended on, wandering aimlessly somewhere. As following my beloved family's advice, I simply look forward. I am now too busy living my life to spare her any thought. I want to talk to your father about a mugging incident involving him. Is he at home now? Yes, he's here. Do you want to see him? The police officer seemed puzzled by my tone for a moment, but eventually said, "Please, let me see him." So I led the police officer into the house and opened the door. "My father is here," I said. The police officer was stunned to see my father there. "This incident happened a few months ago. My name is James, and I'm a fourth-year university student. I've recently decided to work for a major company, but there's still something I'm undecided about, whether or not to take over my father's company. You see, my father is the president of a small factory. When I was younger, I used to aspire to take over the factory and become a president like him. However, those feelings faded during my rebellious phase. I started feeling embarrassed by my father, who was always covered in oil stains from his work clothes. This feeling persisted even as I entered my teenage years and somewhere in my heart, even now as an adult. Despite that, working part-time jobs has given me a newfound respect for my father, who works hard while supporting many employees and their families. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that a salaryman in a suit, working hard, is cooler than my father. One day, while shopping with my father, we were suddenly called out from behind. James, my father, and I turned around together. There stood a man around my father's age named Jack. "Long time no see," he said. It turned out Jack was a high school classmate of my father's and happened to be on an outside sales trip, wearing a suit representing a famous large company. After revealing his impressive job, Jack asked my father, "Did you take over the family business after all?" My father replied, "Oh yeah, we're still managing somehow." Jack scoffed. "That dirty little factory of yours. You've become quite something as its president, and you're only a high school graduate. That's impossible. You really are pathetic." I was shocked by Jack's words. Although I knew my father had taken over the factory after graduating from high school, I never expected a classmate to mock him like that. Nonetheless, Jack continued to smile silently at my father. No, unfortunately, I didn't manage to make my father's factory bigger. Despite my high school dreams of taking over the company and expanding it, I lacked the necessary business sense, and that dream didn't come true. Laughs. I guess I couldn't help it. I'm good with my hands, but my head isn't very business savvy. However, it's a relief that we didn't go bankrupt. Jack seemed to find the situation amusing, laughing heartily and playfully slapping my father on the shoulder. "You're good with your hands, but your head isn't very good. But it's good that you didn't go bankrupt. I thought guys like you were going bankrupt," he chuckled. After exchanging some more banter, Jack mentioned he had more work to do and suggested catching up at the next reunion. With that, he left, leaving my father looking a bit awkward. He turned to me and suggested, "Shall we go?" We resumed our shopping, but at that moment, I couldn't help feeling that my father's work was being mocked, and I didn't offer any rebuttal. The balance between taking over my father's company and continuing to work for a famous large company tilted heavily towards the latter. A few weeks later, by chance, my father's alumni association was held at the bar where I worked part-time. The place was bustling with customers, and I didn't have many opportunities to attend to the table where my father's alumni association was taking place. Although I initially thought it was lucky, when I eventually had the chance to go to that table, I felt a bit embarrassed about serving drinks to my father's alumni association. Despite feeling uncomfortable, I kept quiet because it was my job. Our bar had private rooms, and when I arrived at the table where my father's alumni association was being held in one of the rented-out large rooms, my father, who happened to be near the entrance, greeted me with a smile. "Oh, James, are you his son?" My father asked the woman next to him, who then introduced me as his son. I politely greeted them and arranged the drinks on the table. With eyes resembling my father's and a serious demeanor similar to his, I served the drinks while his drunken classmates teased me, and I awkwardly laughed along. Jack, who was sitting at a table nearby, noticed us and chimed in. "We met recently too, James, right? Are you planning to take over your father's small factory?" I answered honestly, "No, I'm still thinking about it." With an alcoholic breath that disgusted me, Jack loudly proclaimed, "Stop it. Your father's company is nothing special. James should work for a company like me instead of taking over such a company." He then proceeded to brag about his career history, but something seemed off. He had claimed to be in sales when we last met, but now he said he was the head of accounting. Sensing this discrepancy, I kept quiet, knowing it could be troublesome to point it out. However, my father, in his drunken state, spoke up, asking, "Has your department changed since we last met?" "It hasn't been that long. A few weeks ago, was it an urgent transfer? Did sales not suit you?" Jack looked flustered and nodded, admitting, "Yes, that's right. Sales wasn't for me. As soon as I transferred, I became the head of accounting." My father pointed out that the company Jack boasted about had been absorbed by a foreign company, and its accounting department was based overseas. This revelation drew laughter from the crowd. Embarrassed and regretful, Jack mumbled, "I'll go home," and left with heavy footsteps. People around us reassured my father that he hadn't done anything wrong, suggesting that Jack must have always been like that. Seeing my father praised for his honesty rather than being laughed at made me happy, even though he was drunk. My father appeared composed when he spoke up about what everyone else found difficult to address. Half a year has passed since then, and I still spend days contemplating whether or not to take over my father's company. My confusion only deepens day by day, and honestly, I don't know what to do. One day, while relaxing at home, the intercom rang. Since my mother wasn't there, I went to the entrance. "Yes, hello," I said. "You're James?" The visitor in uniformed clothes asked. Surprised and wondering if I had done something wrong, I replied with a stiff voice, "Yes." The police officer then mentioned something about a purse snatching incident and said there was something they wanted to ask my father. "Purse snatching? My father?" I exclaimed. "Yes, your father is suspected of purse snatching." "Is he at home now?" the officer inquired. "Yes, he's here." "But do you want to see him?" I asked. The police officer seemed puzzled for a moment at my tone, but eventually said, "Please, let me see him." I led the police officer into my house and opened the door to the room. "My father is here," I said. The room had a Buddhist altar and a photograph of my father. I then informed the police officer that my father had passed away in a traffic accident, which left him frozen in shock. "I'm sorry for your loss," the police officer said. Curious, I asked who had accused my father of purse snatching, but the officer replied that it was personal information and couldn't be disclosed. After apologizing to me several times, the police officer left. A few days later, while working at my father's factory to fill the void left by his absence, Jack barged in. "Take me to your father. Return what he stole," he demanded loudly, his voice overpowering the noise from the large machines in the factory. I was surprised, and so were the other employees who stopped working and looked surprised. I addressed Jack, saying, "My father isn't here." Jack insisted. "Then call him out right away." "I'm having trouble because your father snatched something from me." I heard a voice from one of the employees murmuring, "Purse snatching? Is it our president?" But Jack remained adamant, crossing his arms and refusing to budge. He kept shouting, "Give me your father." In response, I questioned him. "My father is not the kind of person who would snatch purses. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" Jack insisted. "No, it was definitely your father. He must have been jealous of me working for a big company and snatched my bag. Fortunately, I didn't have my wallet or anything with me at that time, but it's unforgivable that he snatched something in the first place. The police are useless, so I came here myself to talk to him." I inquired about the timing of the incident, and Jack decisively replied, "About 2 weeks ago." The employees began to stir, seemingly confused by the commotion. When I pressed Jack again about the timeline, he grew angry at my persistence, shouting, "What's going on? You keep asking me over and over again." I said it was 2 weeks ago. "An elite like me came all the way to this small and smelly factory just for this. Hurry up and let me talk to your father." Feeling a surge of heat in my chest, I was troubled not only by Jack's derogatory remarks about my father's workplace and colleagues, but also by his attempt to blame my father for purse snatching. My father had passed away in a traffic accident just 1 month ago and couldn't possibly be involved. I clarified this to Jack, who looked stunned and muttered, "Huh." I continued, "How could my father snatch purses when he passed away 1 month ago? Maybe there wasn't even any purse snatching at all." I knew Jack was lying because I had learned at our recent class reunion that he had always been a habitual liar since his school days. Furthermore, it turned out that Jack had been jealous of my father since their school days because the girl he liked had liked my father instead. He had always harbored unnecessary rivalry against my father due to such petty jealousy. I couldn't forgive Jack for trying to pin an unfounded accusation on my deceased father just because of such petty jealousy. As Jack continued to insist on his claim, someone else started shouting from another direction, "Your president wouldn't do something like that. Our president is someone who dresses seriously and walks around like an honest person. Sure, the reason why we are always short-handed is that the president teaches technology and encourages independence. He was a good person who always thought about the staff and business partners without thinking about profits." Voices praising my father rose one after another, and I was honestly moved. I felt ashamed of myself for ever thinking that my father's work was embarrassing. My father was a president who was respected by his staff and loved enough to be protected, even in such a situation. Jack's eyes filled with tears as he heard the voices of the factory workers defending my father. I delivered the final blow. The fact that you tried to frame my father for a lie. I will definitely consult with the police. With that, Jack raised his voice and fled from the factory. Later, as promised, I went to the police to report that my father had been falsely accused by Jack. The evidence was a recording of Jack's statement made by one of the staff members, who had been thoughtful enough to record the argument. Thanks to this evidence, the police acted quickly, and Jack was caught in no time. Jack's lie about accusing someone of a crime became his own crime, and he ended up in jail for a while. I felt relieved that he got what he deserved. A few days later, someone claiming to be Jack's wife came to our house with a gift box to apologize to me and my mother. When I asked if it was because of what happened at the reunion that Jack had framed my father, Jack's wife sighed and confirmed that it was. She revealed that Jack was actually an elite who had been fired from his company and had been struggling to find a job. His obsession with being an elite led him to lie about his status. But when he got drunk, he ended up embarrassing himself with inconsistent lies. He began to resent my father and decided to frame him. Disgusted by his ridiculous reason for lying, I learned that Jack's wife intended to divorce him. Jack apparently had no children, so even if he got out of jail, no one would be waiting for him. After graduating from college, I decided to take over my father's company. One reason was because I was worried about the management of the company since my father had just passed away. Another reason was because I couldn't forget the voices of the staff members who had protected my father when Jack lied about him. I wanted to become a president who is loved and respected by staff members like them. That incident became a turning point for me. Belonging to the Faculty of Business Administration, I could manage the part of management that my father wasn't good at, but I had to learn from staff members about technology. They taught me many things, saying, "If it's for your son," and they also told me many stories about my father. Every time they did so, I realized how great my father was. After work, covered in oil stains, I spoke to his portrait. It's embarrassing now that I used to think this is uncool. This dirt is proof of how hard my father worked. I'll do my best to become a president like you, and I'll definitely make your dream come true. I spoke to his portrait again and felt like my father smiled. I'm going to work hard from now on to become a president like him. I want to fulfill my father's dream of expanding the town factory that has been passed down since my grandfather's generation.